Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we step into a conflict that never truly had a beginning and never truly found an ending. A war without uniforms, without front lines, without a clear moment where peace ever returned. The Mexican drug war. To the world, it is often reduced to numbers, headlines, statistics scrolling across a screen. But behind every number is a street that learned silence, a family that learned waiting, a generation that learned fear before it learned hope. This war did not arrive with an invasion. It grew quietly, through corruption, through desperation, through power traded in shadows. Entire cities changed their rhythms. Nightfall meant disappearance. Police sirens meant different things to different people. And trust became the most dangerous possession of all. This is not the story of one cartel. This is not the story of one kingpin. This is the story of how a nation, Mexico, was reshaped by fear, resistance, survival, and a war no one could fully see. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. This late-night true crime family stretches across the world, and I'm glad you're here. Now settle in, let the day fade, and follow me into the long, silent conflict that changed a nation forever. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. Before the war had a name. Long before the headlines learned the word cartel, long before the world spoke about narcos and trafficking routes, there was only land, quiet towns, dusty roads, farmers working fields inherited from their fathers, and borders that meant very little to the people who lived beside them. In the early years, crime in Mexico did not feel like war. It felt small. It felt distant. It felt manageable. Smuggling existed, but it moved in whispers. A few men moving goods across long desert stretches. A few officials accepting bribes that felt routine. A few families building quiet fortunes without drawing attention. Nothing about it felt like a nation-shaping force. First, in rural villages, the rhythm of life was still measured by seasons, not sirens. Markets opened at sunrise. Church bells still marked time. The nights were dark, but not dangerous in the way they would one day become. People locked their doors because that's what people had always done, not because they feared an army in the shadows. The early smuggling economy didn't look like power. It looked like opportunity. Opium poppies grew in hidden mountain fields. Marijuana traveled north in burlap sacks. Small profits passed quietly through hands that did not yet understand the scale of what they were touching. For farmers trapped between drought and poverty, these crops felt like salvation. For traffickers, they felt like leverage. For officials, they felt like inevitability. Everyone was adapting to survive. No one was preparing for a war. In those early years, power was not violent. It was relational. Who you knew, who your cousin married, who owed your family a favor. Trafficking moved like an extension of local relationships, not like an empire. The border with the United States was long, porous, and lightly watched. Goods crossed hidden in trucks, trains, and long desert caravans. Money came back the same way, slow, steady, invisible to most of the world. There were no mass graves, no armored convoys, no masked men carrying military rifles. Through city streets, only commerce and shadow. Government authorities still felt real in these places. Police were known by name. Mayors could walk into markets unguarded. Disputes were settled with words more often than weapons. Corruption existed, but it had not yet become systemic gravity. It bent the rules. It had not yet replaced them. At this stage, crime did not dominate identity. People did not define themselves by fear. They defined themselves by family, church, harvest, and survival. But every system has a breaking point, and the breaking point came not through violence, it came through demand. Across the border, consumption surged. Drugs moved from fringe markets into mainstream demand. Cities wanted supply faster than shadows could provide it safely. And supply chains do what all supply chains do when demand explodes. They scale, smuggling routes hardened. Players became specialists, bribes grew more expensive. Silence became more valuable. What once moved through relationships began to move through organization. And organization always reshapes power. The first quiet transformation was profit concentration, where many once earned small amounts. A few now earned enormous sums. Those few learned something dangerous. Money could reach further than any family name. Then came territorial thinking, not just routes, zones, control, influence, ownership, and then the final early shift, the one nobody noticed until it was too late. Violence entered quietly, not as chaos, as enforcement, a theft punished. With a disappearance, a betrayal answered with a body left where it could be seen, a warning delivered through rumor instead of gunfire. These acts felt isolated, local, not yet symbolic. But fear spreads faster than explanation, and slowly, invisibly, communities began adjusting behavior without being told to. People stopped asking questions, stopped walking certain roads, stopped noticing which neighbors disappeared. This is how wars begin without announcements, not with explosions, with routine fear. Becoming normal be why the time the nation would one day call it a war. The groundwork had already been laid quietly in fields, markets, and family networks that had once only known survival. The drug war did not begin with a battle. It began with a concession. A small silence, the blind, a survival choice that multiplied quietly. And from that first silence, an entire nation would one day learn what it meant to lose the sound of certainty. The next shift came slowly enough that most people did not feel it happening. It arrived disguised as protection. In the early years, traffickers realized something simple. If the government could not guarantee safety, then they could offer their own version of it. A shop owner who paid was left alone. A farmer who cooperated was given assurance. A family that stayed silent was spared attention. Protection did not yet feel like domination. It felt like insurance. This was the most dangerous stage, because people do not resist protection, they accept it, especially when fear has already been introduced quietly. It first, the presence was subtle. A stranger at the edge of town who asked too many questions. A new truck always parked near the market. Men who were never from the same family, yet always moved together. They were not violent, they were observant. Power was still being tested, not enforced. How far could they push before someone spoke? How long would silence hold? How much money could move before attention followed? In those years, the state still looked stable on paper. Elections continued, schools remained open, courts still issued rulings. From the outside, Mexico did not appear to be changing. But inside small towns and border corridors, the rules of daily life were already bending. Bribes grew more organized, not occasional cash. Monthly expectations, schedules, receipts that were never written down. Police began to feel pressure in two directions: from superiors who wanted reports kept clean, from traffickers who wanted silence kept permanent. Many officers were trapped between survival and duty. Some chose duty and vanished. Others chose survival and adapted. The war had not started, but authority was already being eroded, quietly, profession by profession. Traffickers learned another lesson quickly. You do not need to defeat the state to control a region. You only need to outlast its attention. And attention is always limited. Governments rotate priorities, public interest shifts, budgets rise and fall. But criminal operations persist with singular focus. Across the northern routes, the connection to the United States deepened. Demand continued rising. Trafficking methods improved. Routes multiplied. Money returned faster than it left. With money came equipment, radios, vehicles, weapons, still not armies, but no longer just smugglers. The most important early shift was psychological. Fear stopped being reactive and became anticipatory. People no longer waited for violence to adjust their behavior. They adjusted in advance. This is when power truly settles in. Shopkeepers paid before being asked. Drivers rerouted without explanation. Families refused jobs without knowing why they felt uneasy. Fear became instinct. Why now? Crime had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply illegal. It was structural, woven into work, into transportation, into local economies. And yet, there was still no war. No soldiers in the streets. No federal offensives. No national emergency. Just adaptation. This is what made the coming conflict so devastating. Why the time violence would explode into public view. The foundations of cartel power were already deeply rooted in economics, silence, and routine. What the nation would one day call a war was already functioning quietly as a system. The early generation of traffickers did not think of themselves as warriors. They thought of themselves as businessmen. They traded risk. They measured margins, they managed relationships. Violence was simply a tool, not yet an identity. But tools have a way of reshaping the hands that use them, and soon, violence would no longer be occasional. It would become language. The final calm before the storm is always deceptive because it feels like normal life holding on, when in truth, it is only gathering weight. The Mexican drug war did not begin with one decision. It began with thousands of small ones, taken quietly, taken rationally, taken to survive. And from those quiet choices, the nation was being guided, step by step, toward a conflict no one yet had the words to name. By the late years of this quiet transformation, something fundamental had changed beneath the surface. Crime was no longer something that visited communities. It had begun to live inside them. Not visibly, not loudly, but persistently. Young men who once imagined futures in construction, farming, or trade began noticing a different path. Point one that paid faster. Point one that demanded silence instead of schooling. Point one that rewarded obedience more immediately than patience ever could. They were not recruited with speeches, they were recruited with observation, who needed money, who had no protection, who already lived close to risk. This was not yet a generation of soldiers. It was a generation of helpers, drivers, messengers, lookouts, the smallest jobs, the quietest roles. But every empire begins with small roles. Parents noticed the money first: new shoes, better phones, cash appearing where wages never stretched far enough. Questions were asked softly. Answers came softly too. Work, delivery, connections. Nobody wanted to know more than that. Knowing more came with weight. In these towns, schools still opened each morning. Teachers still gave lessons. But something else was teaching alongside them now. A lesson about speed, speed of money, speed of risk, speed of consequence. The government still existed in these places, but it was beginning to feel distant. Reports were filed and forgotten. Complaints were made and redirected. Investigations arrived and quietly stalled. People learned something slowly and painfully. The system was still operating, but it was no longer prioritizing them. This is when many stopped trying to be seen by the state and started trying to be unseen by everyone. The traffickers had not yet declared themselves rulers, but they were already being treated like unavoidable weather. You couldn't stop it. You could only prepare for it. By now, fear had grown mature. It was no longer sharp. It was low and constant. A pressure beneath every decision. Where to drive, what to say, who to trust. At this stage, almost nothing dramatic happened. And that was the danger, because drama warns, routine numbs. The routes across the north multiplied: desert paths, mountain corridors, rail lines, highway arteries. Money returned faster. Operations grew broader. Trafficking was no longer improvised. It was engineered. Across the border, consumption kept rising. What began as a shadow economy was becoming an industrial demand. An industrial demand does not tolerate delay for long. Inside Mexico, politicians still spoke of progress, growth, stability, reform. But reform was walking while crime was running. In the countryside, more land quietly shifted purpose. Fields changed crops, not visibly, gradually. The kind of change that only becomes obvious years later when the landscape no longer feels familiar. By now, violence had evolved and no longer just punishment. It was communication. A body left where it could be found. A disappearance time to a meeting. A warning delivered without a threat ever being spoken. The message was never explicit, but it was always understood. Communities adapted again. People learned how to misinterpret what they saw, how to not ask who owned the new houses, how to not notice who traveled with protection, how to accept that some doors closed permanently while others opened without explanation. This is the stage where fear becomes tradition, not panic, not shock. A quiet inheritance. From the outside, the nation still looked intact. Tourism continued, cities thrived, commerce flowed, but beneath that movement, another order was now fully alive, an order that did not need flags or speeches, only compliance. The men shaping this new order did not yet see themselves as architects of war. They believed they were simply expanding business, responding to demand, managing risk. They had not yet learned what happens when business absorbs the language of guns too deeply. The final threshold of this early era arrived without ceremony. It arrived when the traffickers no longer needed permission, not from Officials, not from police, not from communities. They simply assumed authority. That is when the system crossed from shadow to dominance. The nation still had no word for what was coming. No labeled no official enemy.no declaration. Only a growing, silent understanding in small towns and border cities alike. Whatever this was, it was no longer temporary. And with that realization, the age before the war truly ended. Not with a battle, but with acceptance that the rules had changed. Chapter 2. When the state declared war. The war did not begin in the streets. It began in offices. In classified meetings. In quiet reports stacked on desks. For years, the shadow world had been growing unchecked inside Mexico. Routes hardened. Money multiplied. Fear became routine. And then something changed. The silence broke from the top. When the government finally spoke the word war, it did not feel like an announcement. It felt like an admission that the state had watched something grow beyond containment. An admission that quiet adaptation had failed. An admission that control had already been lost in places the public still believed were stable. The declaration was framed as necessity, a matter of security, a matter of sovereignty, a matter of restoring order. But for the people who had already been living beneath cartel control, the war did not feel new. It felt late. Federal forces moved into regions that had long been governed by fear rather than law. Checkpoints appeared where silence once ruled. Convoys rolled through towns that had learned not to stare. Uniforms replaced whispers. Weapons replaced rumor. For the first time, two authorities stood face to face: the state and the cartels. The outside world. This looked like strength. The communities caught between them. It felt like collision. Soldiers were young, often younger than the men they were hunting. Many had never been to these regions before. They carried training, not history. They carried orders, not context. The cartels, meanwhile, knew every path, every road that curved away from the highway, every home that offered shelter, every official who had already been paid. The first battles were small: raids on safe houses, weapon seizures, sudden arrests. The news spoke of progress. The language was confident. But violence does not retreat when challenged. It adapts. The cartels did not answer with surrender. They answered with spectacle, public executions, ambushes, messages written in bodies instead of words. What had once been invisible became deliberately visible. This marked the true beginning of the war. Not when the state acted, but when the cartels replied in public. Fear changed shape overnight. Before, it had been quiet and disciplinary. Now it was loud and demonstrative, designed not only to punish, but to intimidate the entire nation at once. Daily life shattered in places where calm had still survived. Markets closed early, schools emptied without warning. Roads became dangerous not at night, but at any hour. People stopped asking which side was safer, because both now carried weapons. The government spoke of reclaiming territory. The cartels spoke through violence that said, "This was already ours." At first, many believed the war would be short, that force would overwhelm organization, that soldiers would restore order quickly, because people often underestimate systems built slowly and quietly. But the cartels had not built themselves for peace. They had built themselves for pressure. They were already fragmented, already mobile, already prepared to lose pieces without collapsing. Where one leader fell, two replacements waited. Where one route closed, three more opened. Where one cell was dismantled, another already existed in silence. The war intensified, not outward, inward, into neighborhoods, into families, into daily routines. Police stations were attacked. Officers were hunted on their way home. Uniforms became targets. Law itself became dangerous to wear. At the same time, corruption did not disappear. It reorganized. Some officials resisted, others adapted again. The war did not clean the system. It stressed it. Communities found themselves trapped between three forces: cartels who demanded loyalty, the state that demanded cooperation, and survival that demanded silence. The war did not bring immediate order. It brought uncertainty multiplied by weapons. Checkpoints that promised safety sometimes became traps. Information that promised protection sometimes traveled to the wrong ears. Trust collapsed on every level. Across the northern border, the demand in the United States never slowed. Drugs still moved. Money still returned. The flow that had built the shadow world did not weaken under fire. IT merely learned how to move faster. Why now? The nation felt different, not in one dramatic way, but in 1,000 small adjustments. People planned days around risk. Routes were chosen for safety instead of speed. Families discussed escape plans the way they once discussed vacations. The war was no longer political. It was personal, and while officials spoke of strategy and progress, ordinary people spoke of survival. The state had declared war believing it could restore control. The cartels accepted war believing it could protect dominance. Neither side fully understood yet what the war would truly become. Not a battle for territory alone, but a battle for how an entire nation would live, the quiet world before the war was gone. And the violent world that replaced it was only just beginning to take shape. The first year of open conflict passed in a blur of movement. More soldiers, more checkpoints, more seizures announced on the news, and with every announcement, the cartels adjusted again. The belief that force alone could restore order began to weaken quietly, not in speeches in exhaustion. Federal convoys rolled through regions that had once known only whispers. Armored vehicles replaced rumor. Helicopters replaced silence. Many outside these areas. This looked like control being restored, but inside these towns, the presence of soldiers did not feel like safety. It felt like being placed between two storms. Night. Gunfire echoed differently. Not as distant warning. As proximity. Too close to ignore, too unpredictable to prepare for. The cartels changed their tactics again. They stopped protecting invisibility. They began protecting deterrence. If the state wanted to be seen, then fear would be seen too. Messages were left where they could not be ignored. On roads, on bridges, the entrances of towns. The goal was no longer secrecy. It was psychological dominance. For many communities, this was the moment when life truly divided into before and after. Before, people adjusted behavior quietly. After, they adjusted existence itself. Families stopped traveling after sunset. Businesses shut unpredictably. Entire streets emptied without explanation. It was not fear of crime anymore. It was fear of collision between powers. Soldiers searched homes. Cartels searched informants. People learned the danger of knowing too much and too little at the same time. Young men were now pulled from two ends, some into the army, others into the cartels, often for the same reason: poverty, lack of alternatives. A promise of money, structure, and survival. This is how wars reproduce themselves. They recruit from the same desperation on both sides. The government spoke of territory regained. The cartel spoke with silence where entire neighborhoods once lived. Both told different versions of the same map. Why now? Corruption no longer looked like bribery alone. It looked like confusion. Conflicting orders, delayed responses, warnings that arrived after danger had already passed. Some officers fought honestly. Others disappeared. Some adapted to survive. Others were removed to set examples. The uniform itself became uncertain. Across the nation, trust thinned, not just in institutions. In predictability. People no longer trusted tomorrow to resemble today. The war began to change how time felt. Plans were no longer long. They became short, immediate, provisional. Markets opened late. Schools closed early. Weddings were held quietly. Funerals became brief. Life compressed. News broadcasts continued. Arrest numbers rose. Seizure totals climbed. But for people living inside the war, these numbers felt abstract because the fear had become ambient, not tied to any one operation. The cartels did not fight the state head-on. They fought it through pressure everywhere at once. Attack a convoy in one region. Disappear a mayor in another. Intimidate a police chief somewhere else. The state spread itself thin trying to answer all of it. Meanwhile, trafficking never truly stopped. Routes shifted. Methods changed. But the demand in the United States never weakened. Money continued returning south, fuel for both sides of the conflict. Now something darker took shape. Ordinary people began disappearing not for what they had done, but for what they might know. This is when fear shifted from rule to contagion. Silence spread faster than violence. People spoke less, trusted less, looked at each other longer before speaking. The war did not only kill bodies. It altered behavior at scale. Why now? The state realized this was no short campaign. It was not a rescue. It was an endurance test. And the cartels realized something equally important. They did not need to win the war. They only needed to make it unwinnable. If the government could never declare victory, then the cartels could continue existing inside the space between, not at peace, not in defeat, but in permanent conflict. The nation entered a new phase. Point 1, where war was no longer an emergency. It became the background noise of daily life. And in that noise, a new generation would grow up knowing only one reality: a country where uniforms and gunmen shared the same streets. The moment the war reached the cities, everything changed. Until then, much of the conflict had lived in regions already accustomed to silence: border corridors, rural routes, mountain towns that had learned to look away. But now the violence moved into places that could not look away, in the great urban centers of Mexico. Life had once felt divided. There was crime, and there was ordinary life. There were dangerous neighborhoods, and there were safe ones. That separation began to dissolve. Gunfire no longer stayed on the edges. That it arrived in business districts, near schools, outside shopping centers, places where people had once believed violence did not belong. The cartels did not need to conquer the cities. They only needed to prove they could reach them. And once that proof was delivered, fear traveled faster than any convoy ever could. The media changed tone overnight. Stories that once appeared as distant headlines now led every broadcast. Live footage replaced rumor. Names replaced statistics. Entire days were consumed by a single act of violence, replayed again and again on screens. What had once been hidden was now unavoidable. Journalists became targets, not for lies, for visibility. Because when fear is exposed too clearly, those who profit from it move to control the narrative. Some reporters vanished, others fled, some kept speaking anyway. But the story they now told was no longer about isolated traffickers. It was about systemic war. Politics shifted as well. Officials who once spoke confidently now weighed every sentence. Security debates dominated elections. Promises grew sharper. Solutions sounded louder. But the war moved faster than politics. Meanwhile, the cartels continued reshaping themselves. They learned to fragment more efficiently, break into cells, shift leadership, repack their structure every time pressure mounted in one place. This made the enemy harder to name, harder to defeat, even harder to define. The state responded with broader deployments, more soldiers, more raids, wider authority. But with every expansion of power came new risk, because power stretched too far always exposes weak points. Corruption adapted again, not as simple bribery, but as strategic placement, delays in deployment, information arriving too late, warnings that appeared just early enough on the other side. The people trapped between these forces, the war now felt total, not total in scale, but total in attention. Every sound mattered, every delay mattered. Every wrong turn carried consequence. Children learned the difference between distant fireworks and nearby gunfire. Before they learned multiplication tables, parents learned how to choose school routes based on the morning's rumor. Before checking the weather, the war no longer happened to people. It happened around them at all times. Across the border, life in the United States continued with familiar rhythms. Most citizens knew of the conflict through screens, through reports, through statistics. The demand that fueled the war remained largely untouched by the war itself. This imbalance created one of the conflict's deepest tragedies. Those who paid the highest price were often those furthest from the profit. By the end of this phase, something impossible to reverse had occurred. The Mexican drug war was no longer a campaign. It was no longer a crisis. It had become a condition. The nation now lived in a space where violence was not shocking, fear was not rare, silence was not empty. And when a war becomes a condition, it does not end with victory. It ends only when behavior itself changes again. The state had declared war believing it could restore the past. Instead, it had crossed into a future that would demand an entirely new way of living. No one could yet say how long it would last. No one could yet say who would truly win. Only one thing was certain now. There was no longer a clear line between peace and conflict. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Cartel Empires. No empire is born loud. It grows quietly first, hidden beneath routine, protected by distance, fed by endurance. By the time the Mexican drug war became a permanent condition, Something else had already taken root beneath the chaos. Criminal organizations were no longer surviving. They were consolidating. In the early years, trafficking groups were loose networks. Family-based, region-based, route-based. They competed, they negotiated, they shifted alliances often. But now, pressure from the state forced a transformation. To survive the war, these groups had to become empires. An empire is not built through violence alone. It is built through territory, logistics, finance, recruitment, information, and above all, time. Across Mexico, the strongest groups began absorbing the weakest. Small crews were given choices: join, disappear, or be removed. This did not happen all at once. It happened gradually. A route here, a plaza there, a contact replaced, a shipment claimed. Soon, entire regions were no longer controlled by dozens of small groups. They were controlled by one name. This changed the nature of power completely. Before, violence had been transactional. Now, it became administrative, used to tax, used to regulate, used to enforce borders that no government had drawn. Cartels began collecting fees, not bribes, not theft, taxes, for operating businesses, for transporting goods, for using roads, for existing without interference. In some regions, businesses paid more to cartels than they paid to the government, and in return, they received something the state could not reliably offer anymore: predictability. Predictability is a form of peace, even when it is built on fear. Now came the second transformation: vertical integration. Cartels stopped relying on middlemen. They began controlling production, transportation, distribution, money laundering. They no longer acted as links in the chain. They became the entire chain. This multiplied wealth at a scale never seen before. Hundreds of millions, then billions. Money that could buy weapons, money that could buy silence, money that could buy futures for some and erase futures for others. With this wealth came another evolution: professionalization. No longer just gunmen. Now there were accountants, engineers, chemists, cyber specialists, logistics, planners. The cartels were no longer criminal gangs. They were parallel corporations, operating beneath the law, competing with one another, and sometimes cooperating when profit demanded restraint. Recruitment deepened. Young men were no longer hired only as lookouts. They were trained, drilled, taught discipline, taught chain of command, taught silence as survival. Some were recruited at 15, some younger. War had become an inheritance. Territory became identity. You were no longer from a town. You were from a plaza, and crossing invisible lines carried consequences as strict as borders between nations. The government still spoke of reclaiming control, but now it faced something far different than smugglers. It faced organizations that operated with military structure, economic depth, territorial governance, cultural influence. The war had not crushed the criminal world. It had scaled it. The cartels began shaping daily life in subtle ways: curfews without announcements, business hours without laws, rules, without signatures. People learned quickly, not from pamphlets, from observation. A store that paid remained untouched. A store that resisted suffered quietly. And the lesson traveled faster than any warning ever could. Now came a deeper shift: public perception. In some regions, the cartels were no longer viewed only as threats. They were viewed as providers. They paid for festivals. They funded churches. They gave money to families after disasters. Not from kindness, from strategy. Fear alone establishes control, but gratitude complicates resistance. This is how empires soften their image without softening their rule. Across the northern border, the flow into the United States reached new heights. The more intense the war became, the more efficiently the drugs moved. This was the greatest paradox of the conflict. The harder the state pushed, the stronger the largest cartels became. By now, people no longer whispered about traffickers. They spoke of cartel names. As fixed points on the map. As realities that would not disappear after one raid or one arrest. The war had entered a new phase, not chaos, consolidation. The age of small traffickers was ending. The age of cartel empires had begun. As consolidation tightened its grip, rivalry became unavoidable. Empires do not grow in isolation. They grow toward one another. And when they meet, space itself becomes the battlefield. Borders that once meant nothing to traffickers now meant everything to cartels. A valley, a highway junction, a port city, a mountain pass. Each one represented money in motion, and where money moves, power follows. The AT first. These rivalries were quiet, a hijacked load here, a vanished courier there, a local boss who stopped answering calls. But quiet rivalry never stays quiet when territory is involved. Soon, entire regions felt the tension before the violence even erupted. More armed men began appearing at road edges. Strangers watched intersections for too long. Convoys moved at odd hours. Communities could feel the air change. This was no longer enforcement. This was positioning. When the first major clashes came, they were swift and overwhelming. Not street fights, coordinated assaults, convoys blocking highways, checkpoints dismantled overnight, entire police units forced to stand down without formal orders. The cartels were no longer hiding their power. They were demonstrating it. The purpose of these battles was not revenge. It was redefinition of the map. Each victory reshaped invisible borders. Each loss erased influence that might never return. What made this phase uniquely devastating was the scale. Before, violence had been selective. Now it was territorial. It did not punish individuals. It contested cities. When a city became contested, ordinary life collapsed instantly. Shops closed without ceremony. Schools stopped opening their gates. Public transportation vanished mid-route. People learned the new rule. When empires fight, civilians become terrain. The state attempted to respond with force. More troops, heavier armor, wider jurisdiction. But empire against empire is not a single front. It is 1,000 shifting fronts. One cartel would strike in the north, another would answer in the south, while a third expanded silently in the east. The government chased fires that never stopped appearing. This is when the war became geographically exhausting. Not one battle, too many at once. The cartels adapted with frightening speed. They learned to split leadership, decentralize command, rotate fighters, shift finances so that no single strike could decapitate the whole. Even when a major leader fell, the empire did not collapse. It redistributed, like water after impact. This resilience altered the psychology of the war. People stopped believing that removing one man would change everything, because it never did. Communities learned to identify which empire ruled not by flags, but by rules, which businesses paid taxes to which authority, which police stations answered to whom, which neighborhoods were safe on which days. Why now? The empires were not only criminal structures, they were unofficial governments. They resolved disputes, they enforced contracts, they punished theft, they regulated movement. The state still existed, but in many regions, it no longer functioned as the primary source of order. This split reality created something profoundly dangerous. A generation growing up with two definitions of authority, point one official, point one enforced. Children could name their local cartel as easily as they could name the president, sometimes more easily, across the border in the United States. Consumption remained steady. Distribution grew more efficient. Street-level markets adapted faster than the law ever could. The demand that fueled everything never paused to consider the cost. Back in Mexico, the empires solidified their cultural presence. Music referenced them. Rumors glorified them. Fear wrapped itself in mythology. This was perhaps the strangest transformation of all. The empire that rose from shadows began to live inside public imagination, not as a ghost, as a force. Young men no longer dreamed only of honest work. Some dreamed of rank, of recognition, of belonging inside something larger than themselves. And once ambition enters war, the war learns how to perpetuate itself. By the end of this phase, the rise of the cartel empires was no longer theoretical. It was visible across the nation, not in one place. In many. The war had transformed from scattered conflict into battles between giants. As the empires expanded, something irreversible took hold. The war stopped being about survival. It became about legacy. Each cartel now understood that it was no longer fighting for routes alone. It was fighting to become a permanent structure in the life of the nation. A power that could not be removed with a single campaign. A presence that could not be erased with a single arrest. In many regions of Mexico, people began marking time not by calendars, but by shifts in control. Before this, cartel After that one dot before the shootings, after the silence, the empires began leaving signatures, not just in violence, but in how they governed fear. Point one ruled through invisibility, another through spectacle. Point one preferred silence, another preferred intimidation so loud it etched itself into memory. Each method shaped communities differently, but all shared one outcome: the erosion of certainty. By now, the cartels no longer felt like temporary invaders. They felt like weather systems, moving slowly, reshaping landscapes, leaving destruction behind without ever needing permission. The government intensified pressure, major operations, wider deployments, international cooperation, but the empires had already adapted to being hunted. They learned how to live inside pursuit. When one territory was lost, another was strengthened. When one faction weakened, a rival grew bolder. The balance of violence never vanished. It only shifted position. By the late stages of this rise, clashes between empires reached a level that stunned even those hardened by years of conflict. Entire towns evacuated overnight. Highways closed for days. Cities held their breath through nights that never fully ended. The cartels now possessed heavy weapons, armored vehicles, intelligence networks, dedicated strike units. They no longer mirrored the state. In some places, they surpassed it in speed and coordination, and yet, they still depended on the same fragile foundation as always: demand, as long as people across the border continued consuming, as long as money returned faster than blood could slow it, the empires would continue rebuilding themselves after every blow. Across the United States, daily life moved on with familiar rhythms. Most citizens experienced the war through screens, through headlines, through distant imagery. The violence remained real, but comfortably far away. This distance became one of the great tragedies of the conflict, because what fuels war is often least touched by it. Inside Mexico, the cartels crossed another invisible threshold. They stopped being outsiders. They became part of the national conversation, discussed, feared, analyzed, sometimes even admired in dangerous whispers. This is how power embeds itself beyond territory. It enters language, music, rumor, identity. Young people spoke cartel names as if they were brands, not because they trusted them, but because they were unavoidable. The empires had succeeded in one critical objective: they made themselves impossible to ignore. By the end of this era, the question was no longer, can the cartels be defeated? It had become, how long can a nation live beside them? The rise was complete. Small traffickers had become dynasties. Routes had become realms. Fear had become infrastructure. And with the empires fully established, the war entered its most brutal phase yet. Not a struggle for survival, but a struggle for total dominance. Some regions would fall completely. Others would resist endlessly, but nowhere would remain untouched. This was no longer a hidden conflict. It was now a defining force in the life of a nation. Chapter 4: Cities Under Siege. For years, the war had lived mostly at the edges: border corridors, mountain routes, rural towns that learned silence early. But when the empires finished consolidating, they turned their attention inward, toward the cities. Cities had always been different: louder, faster, more crowded. Places where anonymity once meant safety. Now anonymity became exposure. In the great urban centers of Mexico, daily life had once followed predictable motion: morning traffic, school rush, office towers filling and emptying. The war did not interrupt this rhythm all at once. It slipped into it first. People only noticed small changes: unfamiliar men standing too still near intersections, vehicles circling the same block without reason, police sirens that passed too slowly. Nothing dramatic, but something unsettled. Then the first urban gunfights arrived. Not hidden, not distant. In full view of daily life. A convoy stopped in traffic. Doors opened. Weapons appeared. And the city learned a new sound. After that, people stopped assuming that danger belonged somewhere else. Schools rehearsed lockdowns. Businesses hired private security. Office workers checked the streets before stepping outside. The cartels never needed to control every block. They only needed to prove they could reach any block. Fear travels faster in cities because of density. Point one act does not frighten one family. It frightens thousands who hear about it within minutes. The media amplified everything: live footage, breaking alerts, sirens layered over. Headlines. What had once been a distant conflict now filled every screen in real time. The cartels understood this power well. They did not fight in cities merely to win territory. They fought for attention that a single spectacular act could echo across the nation, that a single message could shape fear for weeks. Soon, entire neighborhoods became zones of uncertainty, not officially declared, but widely understood. Taxi drivers avoided them. Delivery services refused them. Parents redirected their children around them. This was warfare without front lines. Fear drew the borders instead of fences. Police presence intensified. Patrols doubled. Checkpoints multiplied. But authority now faced a contradiction. The more visible the police became, the more visible their vulnerability became too. Officers were watched. Schedules were observed. Routes were memorized in many places. Cartels knew police movements before police knew cartel intentions. Urban life began to compress. People stayed indoors longer. Public spaces thinned. Parks grew quiet. Nightlife erased itself. This was not evacuation. It was withdrawal without movement. People still lived in their homes, but they lived smaller. The city had not been destroyed. It had been reduced emotionally at the same time. The war carved a deeper divide between wealth and vulnerability. Affluent neighborhoods erected walls, installed cameras, hired private guards. Poorer neighborhoods relied on rumor and timing. Safety became increasingly purchased rather than guaranteed. Some districts learned to negotiate their own fragile peace. Agreements were made quietly. Zones of tolerance were drawn invisibly. Violence paused in some areas not because it ended, but because profit demanded calm there. Other districts became continuous battlegrounds. Control shifted weekly, sometimes daily. For children growing up in these cities, fear became part of orientation. They learned which streets were shortcuts and which were borders. For parents, every day became a calculation, not only where their children went, but when. The city still moved, but its movement had become selective. The war had reached the heart of civilian life, and the heart had learned how to protect itself by beating more quietly. As the cities adapted to fear, a different kind of order began forming beneath the noise, not official, not written, but widely understood. In many urban districts, people learned to recognize the real authority without being told, not through announcements, through patterns. Which stores stayed open late, which buses still ran after dark, which businesses reopened the morning after violence. These were not signs of courage. They were signs of permission. Cartel presence in the cities did not always arrive with gunfire. Often, it arrived through services. Who collected from which business? Who arranged protection? Who decided which neighborhood could function with partial normality? In some areas, garbage collection returned faster under criminal control than under municipal promises. Electricity was restored sooner after outages. Certain disputes were settled not in court, but through men who arrived quietly and left decisions behind without paperwork. This did not make the cartels benevolent. It made them structural. The state still existed, but alongside it now operated a second system, unrecognized, unofficial, yet deeply embedded in the everyday mechanics of the city. For ordinary people, loyalty became irrelevant. Only navigation mattered. How to move without crossing the wrong invisible line. How to speak without attracting attention. How to survive without appearing to take a side. Some cities developed neighborhoods that felt almost normal. Restaurants reopened. Music returned in guarded bursts. People dared to gather again. These zones of relative calm created an illusion that the war was selective, that peace could exist beside violence without consequence. But these calm zones were fragile. They existed only as long as the empires allowed them to. And allowance is not protection. Other neighborhoods remained in permanent tension, shuttered businesses, burned storefronts. Empty streets that once housed entire communities. In these places, silence was not comfort. It was aftermath. Police forces faced impossible choices: patrol aggressively and provoke retaliation, pull back and allow criminal rule to deepen. Every option carried loss. Some officers tried to reclaim streets one block at a time. Others focused on protecting only key locations: hospitals, government buildings, transit hubs. The idea of universal protection had quietly collapsed. Now there was only prioritized survival. Urban youth grew up fast in this environment, not hardened, alert. They learned where to stand on a corner, when to look away, how to distinguish between police sirens and cartel convoys by sound alone. Their childhoods were not stolen in one moment. They were eroded gradually. For families, the calculation never stopped. Which street to use? Which bus route was safer today? Which hour was least dangerous? Every decision carried invisible math. Behind all of this, the empires continued refining their urban strategies. Violence became more surgical, intimidation more targeted, spectacle reserved for specific moments when psychological impact mattered most. The streets were no longer random battlefields. They were managed environments of controlled fear. Media coverage struggled to keep up with the shifting reality. One neighborhood dominated headlines for a week, then another. The nation's attention jumped from fire to fire, never able to extinguish the source beneath them. For those living inside the cities, the constant attention changed nothing. Fear was not refreshed by headlines. It was renewed by routine. This was the great transformation of urban life. Violence no longer felt extraordinary. It felt expected. When nothing shocks anymore, survival becomes quieter. People stopped reacting outwardly. They learned to absorb again. The city learned how to hold trauma without showing it. Car traffic still moved. Subway doors still opened. Markets still sold food. But behind these normal motions lived thousands of private calculations happening at once. And every calculation had the same goal: get home, stay unnoticed, do not be seen as useful to either side. As the siege continued year after year, the cities did not collapse. They hardened into places where life went on because it had to, not because it was safe. As the war settled deeper into urban life, another force began quietly reshaping the cities. Not gunfire, not soldiers, not convoys. Money. Cartel wealth did not remain only in hidden accounts or distant properties. It entered the cities directly, through construction, through transport companies, through entertainment venues, through small shops that suddenly reopened with fresh paint and unexplained funding. Entire blocks were rebuilt not by the state, but by invisible hands. First, this felt like recovery. Shuttered businesses returned. Abandoned buildings were restored. Jobs reappeared where unemployment had swallowed communities whole. But recovery without transparency creates dependency, and dependency creates silence. People gradually realized that some businesses did not answer to the law. They answered to protection. In certain districts, rent prices changed overnight. Homes were bought in cash. Tenants were replaced without explanation. Neighborhoods changed character in months instead of years. This was not gentrification. This was criminal urban planning. Local officials found themselves surrounded by invisible pressure. Approvals requested with politeness. Permits delayed without threats. Maintenance contracts awarded without competition. Everything looked legal on paper, but the paper no longer reflected reality. Corruption in the cities was no longer chaotic. It was methodical. Some officials resisted and were removed quietly. Others adapted slowly. A few convinced themselves they were minimizing harm by cooperating. This is how corruption always deepens. Not with one dramatic betrayal, but with 100 small accommodations made for survival. Meanwhile, the public began sensing that something was wrong even when nothing violent was happening. Announcements felt hollow. Promises felt temporary. The idea of long-term improvement began to sound fragile. Trust, once damaged, does not collapse loudly. It erodes like stone underwater. Urban institutions struggled under invisible strain. Schools remained open but lost students to displacement and fear. Hospitals functioned but learned how to treat victims without asking questions. Public transportation routes changed without explanation. The city was no longer guided by public planning alone. It was being reshaped by fear, money, and silence simultaneously. For ordinary citizens, it became harder to separate criminal influence from daily routine. The streetlight that now worked better than before, who paid for it? The road that was suddenly repaired overnight, who approved it? The business that reopened despite economic collapse, where did the money come from? These questions were rarely asked out loud, because answers carried weight. Why now? The siege of the cities was no longer defined by firefights. It was defined by control. Without visibility, people still went to work, still waited in traffic, still stood in lines for food and medicine. But beneath these normal motions lived something altered, a sense that the city's pulse no longer belonged entirely to itself. The war was no longer only fought with weapons. It was fought with contracts, permits, licenses, payrolls, promises, and this made the conflict harder to identify and nearly impossible to uproot. The state no longer faced only cartels with guns. It faced cartels with influence rooted into the mechanical heart of the cities. This was the deepest level of the siege. Not the destruction of buildings, but the quiet occupation of systems. No barricades were needed. No announcements made. The takeover happened through routine. By the end of this chapter, the cities of Mexico were no longer simply under threat. They were being redefined from the inside out, not by one battle, but by years of silent adaptation. The war had now reached every layer of urban life, visible and invisible, violent and administrative, public and private. And the question was no longer whether the cities would survive. The question had become, what kind of cities would remain once the war finally passed? Chapter 5. The Children of the War. They did not choose this war. They did not vote for it. They did not profit from it. They did not create it. And yet, they were born inside it. Across Mexico, an entire generation grew up knowing only a world shaped by caution, not by innocence, not by certainty. By awareness. For these children, fear was not a sudden shock. It was the background sound of life, like traffic, like weather, like distant sirens that no one paused to count anymore. Their earliest memories were not of explosions. They were of adjustments. A school that closed without explanation. A birthday party that was suddenly canceled. A father who changed route to work every few weeks. A mother who learned to listen longer before answering the door. They learned rules no one wrote down. Do not speak certain names out loud. Do not take photos of the wrong places. Do not linger where strangers watch too closely. These were lessons learned without textbooks, taught through instinct, through tone, through the careful silences adults used when children entered the room. In playgrounds, games reflected reality. Children played border guards, then traffickers, then soldiers. Their imagination absorbed the world as they saw it, not as anyone wished it would be. Schools still taught history, but outside the classroom, children were learning a different subject: how to survive attention. Some became quiet, observant, alert to mood changes in rooms. They learned to sense tension before it erupted. Others went the opposite direction. They grew loud, defiant, restless, because when the world feels temporary, risk feels cheaper. In regions where cartel influence ran deep, recruitment began early, not with weapons, with belonging. Older boys with money and confidence, shiny shoes, fast motorcycles, stories that sounded like power. For children growing up in poverty, this world carried dangerous appeal. It offered structure, recognition. A role. The war did not corrupt childhood in one uniform way. It fractured it. Some children were pulled into criminal networks quickly. Others were pulled into fear just as deeply. Some learned how to move unnoticed. Others learned how to move loudly. What united them all was this: none of them knew peace as a default. For many families, the greatest fear was not violence. It was inheritance. The fear that their children would grow into roles shaped by the conflict, not by choice, but by proximity. Parents tried desperate strategies: moving cities, changing schools, sending children to relatives in safer regions. Yet the war followed silently, through phones, through news, through absence of opportunity. For children living near the northern routes, the presence of the United States shaped expectations in strange ways. Some dreamed of crossing the border to escape fear. Others dreamed of controlling the routes that led there. The war did not only teach violence. It taught economics. Children knew which activities paid, which did not, which professions carried prestige now, which had lost authority. Teachers fought an invisible battle every day, trying to teach futures inside classrooms while the outside world declared different values: patience versus speed, study versus money, law versus power. Some students listened, some drifted, some disappeared. By the time these children reached adolescence, many had already learned how the war truly worked, who could be trusted, when silence mattered, which authorities protected, which only observed. Their adolescence was not defined by rebellion. It was defined by navigation: where to be seen, where to vanish, The most permanent consequence of the Mexican drug war may not be measured in territory. It may be measured in how a generation learned to interpret danger as normal. Not all children of the war became soldiers. Not all became victims. But all were shaped by the same gravity. They carried the war forward without carrying weapons, through memory, through instinct, through a worldview built on anticipation rather than safety. And this generation would one day become teachers, doctors, politicians, parents, leaders. The war would not end with the last gunshot. It would echo forward through them. As these children moved from childhood into adolescence, something quiet but powerful took shape inside them. Not hatred, not anger alone, but adaptation. They learned to read the world the way sailors read water. Subtle shifts in tone, a sudden quiet in a public space. The way adults stopped speaking mid-sentence. All of it meant something. For many, the war did not feel like explosions or headlines. It felt like constant calculation. Where to walk, who to greet, when to stay invisible. In schools across Mexico, attendance became uneven, not because children did not want to learn, but because learning required safety, and safety could not always be scheduled. Some classrooms would be half full one day, nearly empty the next. No explanation was ever written on the board. Teachers learned not to ask where students had gone. Students learned not to explain why they returned. For many adolescents, the future stopped feeling distant. It felt compressed, shortened, uncertain. Dreams became practical, not grand, not abstract, immediate. Work, money, survival. Some turned toward legal trades as quickly as they could. Construction, transport, service work. They chased stability with urgency. Others drifted toward the shadows not because they admired them, but because the shadows appeared organized when the rest of life felt unstable. The cartels understood this age group better than anyone else. They did not recruit through force at first. They recruited through identity, belonging, respect, purpose. A name. A group. A role. For a teenager surrounded by uncertainty, this promised clarity at the same time. Many young people developed deep emotional contradictions. They feared the cartels, but they also saw them as unavoidable, feared the state, but also hoped it would protect them. This tension shaped their psychology. They learned to live with conflicting loyalties that were never chosen. Fear did not always make them cautious. Sometimes it made them bold. When the future feels unstable, risk feels temporarily powerful. In some regions, violence became a marker of maturity. The moment when a child realized they were no longer protected by innocence. For parents, this transition was the most painful to witness, because adolescence once meant growth. Now it meant exposure. Families talked quietly about danger not as a possibility, but as a condition. Conversations changed, not about what children wanted to be, but about where they might be safest being anything at all. Across homes, unspoken rules formed. Photographs at parties. Public displays of wealth. Loud arguments. The war trained families in invisibility. Mental health struggles unfolded silently. Anxiety did not announce itself. It lived in sleep patterns. In appetite. In the constant scanning of surroundings. Some youths carried trauma without language for it. They had never known a world without it. They assumed it was normal. Others reacted through escape. Music, substance use, reckless speed, anything that briefly drowned out the constant vigilance. Yet, even in this world, resilience appeared quietly. Friendships grew intense, loyal, protective, because when danger is everywhere, connection becomes survival. Teachers noticed something profound. These children were not less intelligent. They were hyper-aware. They noticed mood shifts instantly. They detected hypocrisy quickly. They asked fewer naive questions. The war accelerated emotional maturity. Not by wisdom, by necessity. For some young people near the northern border, the idea of the United States became a symbol of escape, not of wealth, of distance, from fear. For others, the border represented the center of the entire conflict, the destination of every shipment. The reason the war never truly ended, as adolescents crossed into adulthood, the war followed them like a shadow that had grown alongside them. Not loud, not dramatic, present. They had learned to live inside uncertainty. To study risk. To adjust expectations downward without losing the will to continue. The deepest impact of The Mexican drug war on this generation was not only physical danger. It was this. They learned to plan lives inside instability instead of waiting for stability to arrive. As this generation stepped into adulthood, they did not arrive as blank pages. They arrived written on by years of uncertainty, not broken, but shaped. They entered the workforce carrying instincts that older generations had never needed: which streets to avoid, when silence mattered, how to read danger without being told. These were not skills taught in schools. They were learned through observation, through repetition, through survival. Many became parents early, not because they were unprepared for responsibility, but because the future had always felt unpredictable, and unpredictability shortens timelines. Some sought stability with urgency. They built small businesses, moved away from contested regions, took jobs that offered routine and fixed schedules. Others remained close to the shadows, not by desire alone, but because the shadows were already familiar, because they understood the rules. The war did not push everyone into crime, but it normalized proximity to crime. This is a deep distinction. For many young adults in Mexico, the state felt abstract. The cartels felt immediate. Neither felt fully trustworthy. This produced a generation that questioned authority instinctively, but also feared challenging it too openly. A quiet contradiction lived inside them. Romantic relationships formed under careful boundaries. Where to meet, which neighborhoods felt neutral, who should not be photographed. Love grew, but under quiet rules. Friendships were chosen carefully, not only for compatibility, but for risk proximity. Who had family ties to which region, who moved freely, who was watched. Career dreams adjusted again. Some youth became lawyers to understand the system that had failed their families. Some became journalists to document what others were silenced from saying. Some became social workers to help children now growing up as they once had. In this way, the war did not only create victims. It also produced witnesses. Yet trauma rarely announces its presence. It lived quietly in sudden anger, deep caution, restless sleep, difficulty trusting calm. For those who had lost parents, siblings, or friends, adulthood did not feel like independence. It felt like inheritance of absence. Many never spoke openly about what they had seen, not because they forgot, because memory sometimes feels too heavy to explain. The war remained inside them not as constant fear, but as permanent awareness. This shaped how they raised children of their own. They taught caution early, not through panic, through tone, through boundaries, through careful routines. In this way, the war echoed forward, not through gunfire, through upbringing. Some found ways to heal, through community, through movement, through distance. Others carried the weight quietly, functioning, working, surviving, without ever fully releasing the tension they had grown up inside. This generation became the bridge between two worlds. One where fear was once unspoken, and one where fear had been spoken too often. They did not believe easily in simple solutions. They had seen systems break. They had seen power lie without effort. They had seen protection fail. But they had also seen people endure. They had seen neighbors rebuild. They had seen kindness survive inside danger. The children of the war had become the adults of Reconstruction, even when Reconstruction looked slow, even when it felt uncertain. The Mexican drug war did not only change borders and institutions. It permanently reshaped how an entire generation learned to feel safe, hopeful, and prepared. And as these adults continue shaping the nation, they do so with minds trained by survival, hearts shaped by quiet resilience, and memories that never fully leave. Chapter 6: Inside the Cartels. From the outside, a cartel looks like violence, weapons, convoys, ambushes, headlines. But from the inside, a cartel is something far more structured. It is a system. Inside these organizations, nothing is random. Not movement, not punishment, not promotion, not survival. Every role is defined. Every level is separated. Every silence has a purpose. The lowest tier are the observers, lookouts. Teenagers on street corners. Men leaning against walls with phones in their hands. Drivers who never ask what they are carrying. Their job is not violence. Their job is information. They report unfamiliar vehicles, police movements, strangers lingering too long, conversations overheard without effort. Information moves upward faster than bullets ever could. Above them sit the transporters, Drivers who move shipments across cities, states, and borders. Some carry drugs, some carry money, some carry weapons. Most are paid by distance, not by loyalty. They rarely know the full route, only their segment, only their stop, because inside a cartel, knowledge itself is controlled. Above transporters are the enforcers, the ones the public knows best. Armed, masked, trained. Their purpose is not chaos. It is discipline. They enforce rules. They deliver punishments. They conduct ambushes when necessary. But they are not decision makers. They are instruments. Above the gunmen are the coordinators. Men who do not fire weapons. They schedule operations, assign crews, manage supply lines, authorize payments. Their power is quieter than the enforcers, but far more permanent. These coordinators answer to regional commanders. Commanders control territories known as plazas. A plaza is not just land. It is routes, cities, warehouses, local officials, police contacts, economic streams. A plaza commander governs like a shadow administrator. He does not patrol streets. He manipulates pressure. Above the commanders sit the true leadership, the architects, the ones rarely seen. They shape alliances, negotiate rivalries, authorize large-scale violence, balance, profit with visibility. These leaders do not think in days. They think in seasons. In years. In cycles of pressure and release. Promotion inside a cartel rarely follows loyalty alone. It follows usefulness. A man who survives pressure. A woman who manages money cleanly. A coordinator who avoids exposure. Survival itself becomes a qualification. Failure is punished quickly, but quietly. Public punishment is reserved for messages. Private punishment is reserved for efficiency. Inside these organizations, fear is not always loud. It is procedural. Everyone knows what happens when rules are broken, because they have seen it, because someone always disappears from the roster. Yet discipline is not maintained by violence alone. It is maintained by incentive, money, protection, status, belonging. Many who enter the cartel world do not initially seek brutality. They seek structure in places where life outside feels unstable. Once inside, leaving becomes difficult, not only because of threats, but because identity shifts. You become known, recognized, cataloged. The cartel does not simply employ you. It absorbs you. Communication inside these systems is layered. Lookouts speak in code. Transporters speak in fragments. Enforcers speak through orders. Commanders speak through intermediaries. Leadership speaks through silence until action appears. Phones are temporary. Names are temporary. Trust is always conditional. Trust inside a cartel is not built on honesty. It is built on shared risk. You trust someone because they stand to lose as much as you do. The internal world is not constant violence. Much of the time, it is waiting. Waiting for instructions. Waiting for movement. Waiting for pressure. And when violence comes, it comes not as chaos, but as execution of decision. Inside the cartel, there is no space for confusion, only for obedience. What makes these systems so enduring is not brutality alone. It is organization without conscience, efficiency without hesitation, structure without compassion. This is the machine that continues operating regardless of who is removed from its top. From the outside, the war appears centered on personalities. Names rise, names fall. But from the inside, the cartel does not depend on personality. It depends on roles that are always ready to be filled. And as long as demand flows, as long as money returns, as long as routes remain open, those roles never stay empty for long. On the surface, members speak of brotherhood, of family, of shared purpose. But beneath those words lies constant evaluation. Who is useful? Who is weakening? Who is becoming a risk? Trust does not rest on history. It rests on current utility. A man trusted yesterday may be eliminated tomorrow if pressure shifts. A woman protected last month may be abandoned if exposure grows too close. This permanent uncertainty creates a condition more powerful than fear. Hypervigilance. Members learn to read rooms the way civilians read headlines. Who arrived late? Who stopped answering messages? Who changed routines suddenly? Every small shift carries meaning. Inside the cartel, betrayal is not dramatic. It is often silent. A piece of information passed slightly too late, at a location shared without emphasis. A warning that never arrives. When betrayal is confirmed, Punishment is swift, not always public, not always violent. Sometimes the punishment is erasure. A name removed from lists. A family relocated without explanation. A commander who never appears again. Fear spreads not through rumor, but through absence. This is how internal discipline is maintained, not through spectacle alone, but through the steady reminder that no one is irreplaceable. Paranoia becomes routine. Phones are changed constantly. Vehicles rotate. Routes vary even when efficiency demands consistency. No one sleeps 2 nights in the same place for too long. Inside the cartel, stability is dangerous. Leadership understands this well. Stability creates predictability. Predictability invites infiltration. Instability is engineered deliberately. Small reshuffles, reassignments, sudden transfers, operations canceled without explanation. Members learn to carry their world in small bags and to leave without questions. Yet, for all this pressure, many remain, not because they feel safe, but because the outside world feels more dangerous without cartel protection. Leaving is rarely clean. You cannot simply resign. You must be forgotten, and forgetting is not something these systems do easily. Some attempt to disappear, changing identities, crossing regions, living quietly. Others are pursued long after they thought the distance was enough, because memory inside the cartel is long, and departure is always treated as potential betrayal. Internal purges occur during periods of intense outside pressure, when leaders suspect leaks, when operations fail too often, when arrests come too fast. In those moments, suspicion spreads inward. The enemy is no longer only the state or rival cartels. It is the people who stand beside you. Friends become shadows. Enemies wear familiar faces. During purges, violence turns surgical, not loud, not chaotic, specific. These periods do more damage to the internal structure than any external raid, because they destroy the illusion of safety from within. Yet, even after purges, the machine continues. New recruits fill missing roles. New commanders rise. Fear is redistributed, and life inside resumes its familiar rhythm of tension. From the outside, these organizations appear to thrive on brutality. From the inside, they thrive on replacement. No one is indispensable. This belief allows the system to survive even when leadership collapses. Many members age out faster than expected. Their paranoia burns them. Their nerves fracture. Their sleep vanishes. The pressure is not only physical. It is psychological erosion. Some turn to substances to dull vigilance. Others isolate themselves emotionally. A few become numb. Yet even numbness can be useful, because numbness obeys without hesitation. This is the contradiction at the heart of every cartel. It demands ruthless loyalty, but never truly offers security in return. What keeps people inside is not trust. It is entanglement. Money tying families to danger. Secrets tying individuals to consequence. Reputation tying past to future. The deeper someone goes, the fewer exits remain. From the outside, the war looks like a clash of giants. From the inside, it feels like a corridor that keeps narrowing. Every promotion tightens it. Every success attracts attention. Every mistake becomes fatal. The cartel rewards survival and punishes visibility. Why now? We can understand why so few who enter this world ever leave it intact. Not because they are hunted, but because the system reshapes how they think, how they trust, and how they sleep. Over time, the greatest damage inside a cartel does not come from bullets. It comes from exhaustion. Years of vigilance without rest. Years of sleep broken by alerts. Years of waking without knowing whether the day will end quietly. This kind of pressure does not explode. It wears down. Veteran members begin to change, not suddenly. Subtly, they speak less. They arrive later. They hesitate where they once acted without pause. Leadership notices hesitation immediately, because hesitation is weakness, and weakness invites replacement. Some veterans are removed not for betrayal, but for fatigue. The system depends on relentless motion. Anyone who slows becomes a liability. Others attempt to secure quieter roles, managing finances, supervising storage sites, overseeing logistics from distance. These roles offer reduced exposure, but also increased suspicion. Because distance from violence often signals preparation for escape, at this stage, many begin to carry two lives at once. the visible one inside the organization, the imagined one outside, a future they do not speak of, a place they may never reach. For a small number, internal pressure becomes unbearable. They cooperate with authorities, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of desperation. These informants rarely survive long, not always because they are caught immediately, but because secrecy corrodes them from inside. They live with divided loyalty, divided identity, divided faith in every word they speak. When informants are exposed, the system responds brutally, not only to punish, but to reassert certainty. Yet even the exposure of betrayal creates a deeper wound internally, because once betrayal is proven, trust never fully returns. Whole factions become suspicious of one another. Operations slow, communication tightens, mistakes increase. The machine that once felt unstoppable begins to grind unevenly. Not because power is gone, but because confidence is fractured. Burnout becomes visible in small ways: slower response times, poorer judgment, internal disputes over territory that once would have been resolved calmly. Violence between rival cartels is devastating, but violence inside a cartel is destabilizing. It erodes coordination, fragments alliances, weakens command. At this point, leadership often changes rapidly. Commanders rise and fall in quick succession. No dynasty holds long. From the outside, these shifts look chaotic. From the inside, they feel like freefall. Members begin to realize something few ever speak aloud: the system they serve will survive them, but it will not protect them. This realization produces different outcomes. Some double down on loyalty, hoping fear will shield them. Some become reckless, believing survival is already uncertain. Others attempt to withdraw quietly into irrelevance. Very few succeed in disappearing, not because the cartel hunts them forever, but because life inside leaves marks. Contacts that remember, enemies that recognize, records that never fully fade. The deeper truth is this: for all its structure and power, the cartel is not a stable world. It is a temporary state built on permanent risk. Those who rise highest inside it fall hardest, because they become the most visible targets. Leadership lives with a constant contradiction. They control everything, except their own future. As years pass, the internal cost becomes clear: broken families, disconnected children, lives lived in motion without rest. The cartel promises power, but it delivers confinement of another kind. A cage without walls, built from paranoia, reputation, and irreversible decisions. From the outside, the cartel looks like an empire. From the inside, it feels like a narrow tunnel that only tightens. This is the final truth of the internal world. The cartel does not only destroy communities. It consumes its own people slowly, quietly, and without ceremony. By the time an empire appears ready to fall, it has often already collapsed inward, long before the headlines ever announce it. Chapter 7: The Money That Never Sleeps. Wars are often described in terms of weapons, guns, armored trucks, soldiers in the streets. But the true engine of this war has always been quieter: money. The Mexican drug war is not powered by ideology. It is powered by demand, movement, and payment. A cycle that does not pause for mourning. A system that does not sleep. At the center of this enormous financial current stands one simple reality: as long as people in the United States continue to buy, money will continue to flow into Mexico. And where money flows, power follows. Every shipment that crosses the border carries not only drugs. It carries salary for drivers, for lookouts, for enforcers, for accountants, for commanders. By the time one package reaches a street dealer, it has already paid dozens of lives along the way. Not in blood alone. Independence. The first layer of cartel money looks simple: cash from street sales, bills stacked in small rooms, counted by hand, wrapped in plastic. But this is only the surface, because cash is dangerous. It attracts attention. It leaves no explanation. It smells like crime to every system built to detect it. The real work begins after the money is earned. Laundering. Money must be transformed, from illegal to spendable, from suspicious to invisible. It is moved through cash-heavy businesses, restaurants, car washes, construction companies, transport firms. At first, these businesses look ordinary. They employ people, pay rent, serve customers. But behind the counter, numbers do not add up naturally. Too much profit, too few customers. The goal is not to explain everything. It is to explain just enough. From there, money moves again. Through false invoices, phantom employees, overpriced imports, underreported exports. A shipment of goods looks legitimate, but the paperwork behind it carries the weight of crime. Banks receive these funds, often without knowing, sometimes with silence. Money passes through accounts like water through sand. By the time it emerges on the other side, it no longer looks like cartel. Money. It looks like profit. With clean money, the cartels do not merely survive. They expand. They buy land, warehouses, fleets, weapons, political influence. Money reshapes territory more efficiently than violence ever could. In some regions, entire local economies become entangled with cartel finances. Jobs depend on businesses that depend on laundering. Transportation depends on fuel paid by illegal revenue. Supply chains become mixed with shadow money. At this stage, the line between legal and illegal becomes nearly impossible to draw cleanly, because the same peso may pay both a teacher's salary and a gunman's wage within the same week. This is how an underground economy becomes structural. It no longer exists beneath the legal world. It intertwines with it. The state can arrest traffickers. It can seize shipments. It can destroy labs. But tracing money through layers of legality is slower, more complex, and often more dangerous politically, because money touches powerful interests, not only criminals, but businessmen, contractors, officials, financiers. Every major crackdown on cartel finances threatens to expose more than crime. It threatens to expose complicity. For this reason, financial war moves more slowly than armed war. It is fought with audits, algorithms, court filings, international cooperation, and it often takes years to dismantle what violence built in months. Meanwhile, the cartels never stop adapting. When one route becomes risky, another opens. When one laundering method is exposed, another replaces it. The system is designed for continuous motion. Money that never sleeps creates power that never rests. Even during active warfare, even during internal collapse, even when leaders fall, the true strength of the cartels has never been their gunmen. It has always been their financial bloodstream. As long as that bloodstream continues to circulate, arms will be purchased, men will be recruited, silence will be bought, fear will be funded. This is why the war cannot be ended by force alone, because force attacks bodies, and finance sustains the structure itself. As the rivers of money widened, they began crossing borders just as easily as the shipments themselves. Cartel finances were no longer local. They became global. Cash left small towns in hidden compartments. But it returned as investment. As real estate. As vehicles. As storefronts. As energy projects. As legitimate commerce. The transformation was quiet, but the reach was enormous. In financial centers far removed from the violence, numbers appeared on screens with no sign of their origin. No sound of gun fired, no scent of chemicals, no memory of fear, just transactions. This is how distance protects the system. The further the money travels from the suffering that created it, the safer it becomes. Shell companies appeared in layers. One company owned another, which owned another. Each one registered in different jurisdictions, each one signed by different names, none of them speaking directly to the truth. Money moved through shipping invoices, through import-export gaps, through construction budgets that inflated just enough to hide shadows inside spreadsheets. The outside world. These were business irregularities. The cartels. They were arteries. This financial architecture allowed the empires to survive even when physical operations took heavy losses. A lab could be destroyed. A shipment seized. A commander arrested. But the money already in motion did not stop. It simply rerouted. This is why cartel power often appears to recover faster than the communities it devastates, because money rebuilds faster than trust. Entire sectors of the informal economy became dependent on cartel financing without always knowing it. Truck drivers carried loads without knowing who paid for the fuel. Suppliers accepted contracts without knowing the origin of the capital. Workers earned honest wages from businesses funded by invisible crime. This created a condition more dangerous than fear: ambiguity. When people cannot clearly see where the danger begins, they cannot clearly resist it either. In some regions of Mexico, construction boomed while violence climbed. New buildings rose. New businesses opened. The casual observer. It looked like growth to those who looked closer. It felt like overlay. Prosperity built atop instability. The state faced a dilemma it never fully solved. To dismantle the financial network entirely would require exposing business leaders, local officials, banking failures, political complicity. Such exposure threatened more than cartels. It threatened credibility. As a result, financial crackdowns often moved carefully, selectively, targeting smaller operators, disrupting portions of the flow, but rarely confronting the full architecture at once. This allowed the system to survive in fragments. Even when certain channels were blocked, across the border in the United States, the retail end of this economy remained largely isolated from the violence upstream. Most buyers never saw the ladders of money behind their purchase. Only the product, only the price, only the moment. This separation between consumption and consequence became one of the most enduring engines of the war. The buyers were far, the sellers were hidden, the victims were elsewhere, and so the money continued to move without moral interruption. Within the cartels, this wealth reshaped priorities. Operations were no longer designed only to move drugs. They were designed to protect financial systems. Warehouses were replaced faster than people. Routes were reorganized around efficiency rather than tradition. Violence itself became a financial calculation. How much disruption could be tolerated before profit was threatened? How much fear was necessary to maintain control without choking commerce? This is when brutality becomes economic strategy. Some leaders even delayed violence deliberately, not out of mercy, out of spreadsheet logic, because instability scares investors, even criminal ones. In this way, money did what morality never could. It placed limits on cruelty when profit required calm. Yet those limits were thin. They disappeared whenever dominance or retaliation demanded spectacle. The financial world created by the war became its own ecosystem. Profits fed protection. Protection fed silence. Silence fed longevity. And longevity fed a dangerous illusion that the system was too large to collapse. This belief spread among members at every level, among transporters, among coordinators, among leadership, that as long as money flowed, the empire would endure. But money carries one weakness no weapon can correct: visibility. Every transaction leaves a trace. Every transfer leaves a pattern. Every buildup leaves a shadow inside numbers. This truth moved slowly, behind screens, behind court filings, behind agencies that no one in the streets ever saw. And for the first time, the war began to develop a second front, not in cities, not on highways, but inside spreadsheets and balance sheets. The pressure did not arrive with helicopters or convoys. It arrived with questions, quiet ones. At first, the cartels barely noticed. A frozen account here. A delayed transfer there. A bank suddenly requesting additional documentation. It felt like inconvenience, not threat. But financial pressure does not announce itself the way violence does. It tightened slowly, silently. Agencies began comparing patterns across borders: unusual movement, repeated shell structures, circular transactions that moved money without moving goods. Numbers that looked clean in isolation began to look unmistakable when stacked beside one another. For the first time, the war reached the empires in a place they had always believed was safest: their accumulated wealth. Cash seizures hurt, but account seizures destabilized, because cash can be replaced, infrastructure cannot. Suddenly, crews were delayed waiting on funds that had always arrived on time. Weapons purchases stalled. Payments to local protectors arrived late. Logistics slowed. The machine still functioned, but no longer with its former smoothness. Inside the cartels, commanders grew tense, not from fear of arrest, from fear of interruption. Money had always been the one constant, the one assurance that whatever failed could be rebuilt. Now even that assurance began to feel fragile. Some leaders attempted to move wealth faster, to consolidate assets into fewer hands, to shift funds into harder forms: gold, property, vehicles, luxury goods that could move quietly. Others tried the opposite. They fragmented finances, spread risk into hundreds of small channels, believing dispersion would protect invisibility. Both strategies carried danger. Consolidation created obvious targets. Fragmentation created chaos. Meanwhile, the legal systems moved slowly, not with force, with endurance. Court cases unfolded over years, documents examined. Ownership traced backwards through layers of false identity. The work was slow, but unlike gunfire, it accumulated results quietly. For the first time in the war, some cartels found themselves rich in men, but poor in fluid power. Gunmen remained. Routes remained, but operating room narrowed. This produced a new kind of internal pressure, disputes over money, accusations of mismanagement, claims of theft. Financial strain exposed fault lines that violence had always kept hidden. Members who once tolerated each other under shared profit now turned suspicious when profit shrank. Alliances thinned, rivalries hardened. The war that had always been visible through blood now developed a less visible turn. Economic cannibalization. Some factions broke away not for territory, but for cash access. They sought their own laundering pipes, their own brokers, their own protection in the financial world. This fractured the empires further, not by forced by funding. Across Mexico, communities began noticing something subtle. Violence shifted in rhythm, not necessarily less, but less predictable. Operations once driven by smooth logistics now stumbled into improvisation. And improvisation increases risk at the same time. The international financial system faced growing pressure. Banks tightened compliance. Transfers slowed. Suspicious movement flagged automatically. Each tightening action felt small in isolation, but together, they forced the financial bloodstream to work harder for every movement. For organizations built on speed and invisibility, resistance is deadly. Across the border in the United States, retail sales continued. But upstream, profit did not move with the same ease. The imbalance began to show. This financial slowing did not end the war. Nothing so clean ever happens, but it introduced something new into the cartel world. Constraint. For the first time in decades, not everything could be solved with cash. Not every problem could be purchased away. Not every silence could be guaranteed. And when money loses its ability to erase friction, structures begin to crack. The cartels had always believed their invincibility came from wealth. They were wrong. Their invincibility had only come from untouched flow. Once that flow was disrupted, the war began to feel different inside the empires. Not louder, more desperate, more reckless, more compressed. This was the great irony of the Mexican drug war. Weapons could not end it. Arrests could not end it. Territory could not end it. But the slow tightening around money, the invisible constriction around profit, this was the first pressure the empires could not intimidate into retreat. The money still flowed, but it no longer flowed freely, and freedom of money had always been their truest power. Chapter 8. The Faces of Power. For years, the war had been described as a conflict between forces, the state, the cartels, the military, the streets. But behind every force, there were always faces, not always visible, not always photographed, often unknown even to those who followed headlines closely. Power in the Mexican drug war did not sit in one place. It moved quietly, from hand to hand, from phone to phone, from safe house to safe house. Some leaders ruled with spectacle, others ruled with silence. Some commanded through fear, others through money and patience. The world often imagined cartel leadership as static. Point one kingpin, point one throne, point one domain. The reality was far more unstable. Leadership was not a crown. It was a position under constant pressure. In many cases, a leader rose not because he was the strongest, but because everyone stronger was already dead. Power passed upward through absence, not victory. These figures rarely resembled the legends built around them. They were not always violent by nature. Many were calculated, restrained, obsessed with time, with balance, with exposure. Some lived quietly in ordinary neighborhoods. A man walking his dog in the evening. A woman managing accounts from a small office. A businessman known for building homes and funding festivals. From the outside, nothing distinguished them, but behind them moved armed shadows, invisible protection woven into daily routine. These leaders did not shout commands. They sent messages coded in routine. A delayed delivery. A canceled meeting. A Sudden reassignment. Point one such signal could shift entire regions. Inside Mexico, some leaders were known by name, others only by nickname, others not even that. Power did not require identity, only obedience. Meetings rarely happened in groups. Too many eyes, too many risks. Leadership communicated through layers. If one layer fell, the next absorbed the shock. This made power feel distributed, yet centralized at the same time, that no single capture ever stopped the machine. When high-profile leaders were removed, the public often believed the war had turned a corner. But inside the organizations, the response was almost procedural. Command shifted, routes were reassigned, payments adjusted. Life continued under a new voice. For the communities beneath them, the face of power often changed, but the rules did not. Some leaders attempted to limit violence, not from morality, from strategy. They understood that excessive spectacle attracted attention, and attention endangered profit. Others believed terror itself was power, and that fear created faster submission than patience ever could. This difference in leadership style shaped entire regions. Point one city lived under quiet control, another under constant shock. The war was not uniform. It reflected the personalities who sat at the top at any given moment. But what every leader shared was one certainty. Their position was temporary. N01 aged into peaceful retirement. N01 ruled without pressure. N01 stepped down cleanly. Power inside the cartels was not inherited like a titled. It was seized, defended, lost, and seized again. This created a culture where loyalty was conditional and succession was violent. Every second in command watched the leader. Every leader watched their shadow. Fear at the top was different from fear in the streets. It was not about survival alone. It was about replacement. The higher someone climbed, the fewer directions they could move, until every path led either forward or into absence. For many of these leaders, the most dangerous enemy was not the state. It was the person waiting quietly behind them. Across the border in the United States, their names were spoken like villains in distant stories. But inside their own organizations, their authority rested on something far less dramatic than myth. It rested on money flow, information control, fear management, and the ability to disappear at will. Some leaders lasted months. Others survived years. None were permanent. This instability at the top created constant turbulence. Below, orders shifted, strategies changed, alliances realigned. Entire crews could be loyal one month and targets the next. Leadership did not stabilize the war. It accelerated it, because every new face felt the need to prove something. Strength, control, legitimacy, and proof, in this world, was almost always delivered through action visible enough to be feared. As leadership changed hands again and again, something else quietly grew inside the empires: insecurity. Every new leader inherited not only power, but suspicion. They inherited networks they did not fully build, lieutenants they did not fully choose, alliances they did not fully trust. This created a constant need to reassert control, not once, but repeatedly. Some leaders did this through money, increasing payments, rewarding loyalty, buying silence again and again. Others did it through fear, immediate punishment, public examples, swift removals of anyone who hesitated. Both strategies carried risk. Point one drained resources, the other multiplied enemies. Leadership became a balancing act between visibility and survival. Be too quiet, and rivals assume weakness. Be too loud, and the state takes notice. Many leaders lived in a permanent state of calculation: where to sleep tonight, which safe house tomorrow, which convoy to trust. Their world shrank as their power expanded. They could control dozens of cities, but move freely in none. Family life disappeared. Children were kept distant. Partners were isolated. Names were changed. Addresses erased. Some leaders rarely saw their own families in person. Contact was managed through screens, through intermediaries, through silence that pretended to be care. This isolation did not produce wisdom. It produced distortion. Leaders began to see the world only through risk. Every delay felt like betrayal. Every mistake felt like conspiracy. Every quiet moment felt temporary. This mindset accelerated violence. Because suspicion never rests, rivals did not need to organize open rebellion. They only needed to fuel doubt that a rumor heard a failed delivery there. Suddenly, internal purges began without confirmation that in this way. Leadership often destroyed itself faster than any enemy ever could. Public perception of these figures followed a strange pattern. Some were mythologized. Names became symbols. Stories grew larger than truth. Others vanished without a trace. Point one day. Feared, the next forgotten. Power, in this war, did not ensure memory. It only ensured momentary attention. When a leader fell, the news cycle moved quickly. Headlines flared, then faded. But inside the organization, the consequences lasted far longer. Successions were rarely smooth. Factions formed. Territory fractured. Money streams tangled. This created windows of chaos. And chaos is the most dangerous form of opportunity. Rival groups rushed in. Smaller crews attempted expansions. The state launched operations. Communities were caught in the middle as boundaries shifted overnight. Leadership turnover did not weaken the war. It reshuffled its violence. Some leaders attempted to rebrand their control, reducing random displays, lowering visible conflict, negotiating temporary pacts with rivals. These moments created rare lulls, short seasons where fear softened slightly, where streets reopened, where people dared to believe the worst might have passed. But stability built on criminal negotiation is always provisional. It ends when profit demands expansion. Or when ambition demands supremacy. Eventually, every truce eroded, every calm unraveled. What remained consistent was not the faces, but the pattern. Rise, consolidate, overreach, collapse, repeat. Leadership became less about dominance and more about how long one could delay replacement. Some leaders lasted longer by avoiding spectacle. They stayed out of the spotlight, refused to attach identity to violence, let others absorb attention while they shaped finances and alliances quietly. These silent leaders were the most difficult for the state to reach because they did not seek narrative. They sought longevity. And yet, even they lived with the same inevitable truth. Power in this war could never be secured, only borrowed. By the late years of the conflict, leadership no longer symbolized control. It symbolized exposure. The higher someone rose, the brighter the target became. The faces of power did not represent certainty. They represented risk, taken to its furthest limit. And as each new face stepped forward, the war adjusted itself again, not pausing, not reflecting, only continuing. The collapse of leadership rarely arrived with warning. It arrived with interruption. A convoy that never reached its destination. A phone that never rang again. A safe house that did not remain safe. For the public, these moments appeared as headlines. A name. A photograph. Handcuffs. Flashing lights. The image of power finally exposed. In cities across Mexico, people would pause briefly at televisions. Some with relief, some with doubt, some with the quiet understanding that another face would soon appear. In its place, televised arrests created an illusion of finality. A king removed from the board. A threat neutralized. A victory declared. But inside the cartels, the reaction was never surprise. It was procedure. Succession plans activated instantly. Routes reassigned. Payments redirected. Command transferred. The machine did not stall. It shifted gears. For the captured leader, power ended the moment freedom vanished. No more negotiation. No more protection. Only the long corridor of detention. Many faced trial eventually. Some faced extradition to the United States. Distant courtrooms far from the cities they once controlled in shadow. Their names became case numbers. Their empires became evidence files. For a brief moment, their capture felt like closure, especially to families who had suffered quietly beneath their rule. But closure, in this war, never arrived in full. Because no single arrest dismantled the structure beneath it. Some leaders were never captured. They vanished. One day issuing orders, the next day erased from communication. In the cartel world, disappearance always carried two possible meanings: escaped or execution. No one outside ever truly knew which, and inside, only a few ever did. These disappearances created legends, rumors of relocation, rumors of betrayal, rumors of secret deals with the state. Myth replaced information. And myth is heavier than truth. As years passed, The cycle repeated again and again. A leader rises, a leader consolidates, a leader falls. Each fall sent ripples through entire regions. Prices changed overnight. Routes shifted. Violence surged or softened depending on who stepped forward next. The faces of power changed, but the war did not. For civilians, this repetition became emotionally numbing. They learned not to celebrate arrests too loudly, not to mourn escapes too deeply, not to believe in endings. Power had proven itself to be temporary and transferable, not removable. Some leaders attempted to reinvent themselves, moving into legitimate business fronts, reducing visible violence, blending into upper society. These figures became more difficult to identify. They wore suits instead of camouflage. They held charity events instead of roadblocks. Their influence did not disappear. IT simply changed its texture. For the state, these transformations created new problems. The enemy no longer always looked like an outlaw. Sometimes it looked like a benefactor, a sponsor, a builder. The war against faces became a war against appearances. Meanwhile, younger commanders continued rising, not driven by ideology, not driven by tradition, driven by speed. These newer leaders were often more reckless, less patient, more public. They had grown up inside the war, and they carried none of the caution that earlier generations had learned. This generational shift made leadership even more volatile. Power passed faster. Violence escalated quicker. Mistakes multiplied. By this stage of the conflict, leadership no longer stabilized regions. It destabilized them. Communities could feel the difference between an older, calculating commander and a younger, impulsive one. The older sought balance. The younger sought dominance. And dominance always demanded spectacle. In this way, the faces of power shaped not only strategy, but the emotional climate of entire regions. Fear felt different under each ruler, heavy under some, chaotic under others. The greatest illusion the war ever created was that removing a leader removed a threat. In truth, it only removed a person. The system waited, ready. The faces of power were never the war itself. They were only the expressions it wore for a time. And when one face disappeared, another was already forming in its place. Chapter 9. The Women of the War. For years, the war was described through men, cartel leaders, gunmen, soldiers, commanders, but beneath the noise of headlines, another story unfolded quietly. The story of women who moved through the war in ways the cameras rarely followed. In Mexico, women did not experience the war as a single role. They experienced it as mothers, daughters, partners, workers, survivors, and sometimes participants. Some lived closest to the violence. Others lived at its edges. All lived under its weight. For many women, the war first entered their lives not through gunfire, but through absence. A husband who did not return. A brother who vanished between jobs. A son who left for work and became unreachable. These absences were rarely explained. There were no confirmations, no official notices, just silence that settled into daily routine. Women became the ones who waited, not for answers, for certainty. Some became heads of households overnight, not by choice, by necessity. They learned how to manage fear the way others managed. Finances. Carefully, quietly, constantly. In neighborhoods shaped by cartel control, women also learned an unspoken rule. Visibility could be protection or danger. Some operated businesses under the protection of invisible agreements. Others closed their doors entirely to avoid attention. All learned how to read the temperature of a street without asking questions. Inside the cartels themselves, women held many roles, not always visible, but often essential. Some managed money, recorded transactions, moved funds through legitimate fronts. They were trusted not because of sentiment, but because they were precise. Others handled communication, passing messages, arranging logistics, maintaining links between cells that could not speak directly. Some served as intermediaries between leaders and the outside world. Their presence created the illusion of normal life. While decisions of violence traveled quietly through their words, a smaller number became public figures inside the criminal world, not as gunmen, but as symbols of status. Partners displayed as proof of power, beauty used as a sign of dominance, visibility used as intimidation. For many of these women, safety was conditional, tied not to law, but to the mood of someone else's authority. Some women chose this world. They entered seeking money, power, escape from poverty. Others were pulled into it through relationships they did not understand until it was too late. Love became leverage. Trust became risk. Leaving was rarely simple, because association itself created danger. Beyond the criminal world, most women experienced the war as daily adjustment. They changed routines. They walked different streets. They learned to listen for changes in silence. Mothers taught children new rules, not for success. For survival, that do not answer unknown numbers, do not speak names outside the house, that do not linger where you are noticed. These lessons were passed quietly between generations of women. Not as ideology as protection, some women became activists, searching for the disappeared, documenting what others feared to write down, standing in public with photographs when silence became unbearable. They did not carry weapons, they carried memory. Others became caregivers in hospitals overwhelmed by violence, treating wounds without asking questions, protecting patients without knowing which side they belonged to. For these women, neutrality became a form of courage. Across the border in the United States, women often encountered the war differently, through migration, through displacement, through families split between safety and memory. Some arrived carrying only what they could hold, and stories they were not ready to speak. The war did not make women only victims, it made them witnesses, and witnesses change history quietly. They kept families intact when others vanished. They rebuilt routines in broken neighborhoods. They created normalcy inside chaos where normalcy did not naturally return. Their strength was rarely visible because it was expressed not through confrontation, but through endurance. For many women, the most dangerous part of the war was not what happened outside, it was what followed them quietly inside the home. Fear did not always arrive with loud violence. Often, it arrived as anticipation. The sound of a car slowing at night, a knock that came at the wrong hour, a phone that rang without a number. Women learned to interpret these moments with instinct rather than logic. Because logic offered no protection, only timing did. Some women lived beside men involved in the conflict. Without knowing the full truth, they noticed changes before they understood danger. Late arrivals, sudden money, unfamiliar caution. By the time many understood what world they had been pulled into, the exit had already closed. Coercion rarely announced itself as violence at first. It arrived as dependence, financial, emotional, protective. A woman might accept help once, then again, and then realize that what looked like support had become a chain. Inside these relationships, affection and threat existed, side by side. Protection came with conditions. Comfort came with silence. Some women attempted to leave, a few succeeded. Many did not, because leaving did not mean freedom. It meant being remembered. For others, the war forced roles upon them they would never have chosen. A widow who became a provider overnight, a sister who raised children that were not hers, a daughter who became the spine of an entire household without ever being asked. They did not seek strength. They were required to become strong. In neighborhoods shaped by constant loss, women created informal safety networks. They warned each other without saying names. They watched each other's children. They passed information in fragments that only locals understood. This quiet cooperation did more for survival than any official patrol ever could. Some women chose resistance openly. They searched for the disappeared long after institutions stopped pretending to care. They walked together with photographs, names, dates. Their courage did not roar. It stood. Each demonstration was an act of defiance against forgetting, because forgetting is the final violence. Many of these women faced threats, phone calls that ended in silence, strangers who appeared near their homes, warnings that carried no signatures. Yet they continued, not because they felt brave, because memory demanded movement. Other women resisted in quieter ways. Why leaving contested regions. Why pulling their children out of environments that felt poisoned by inevitability. Why choosing distance over confrontation. Escape did not always mean crossing borders. Sometimes it meant crossing into new identity, new routines, new invisibility. In these transitions, women often carried guilt that never fully faded. Guilt for surviving when others did not. Guilt for leaving when others stayed. Guilt for safety that still felt conditional. Inside detention centers and courtrooms, Women appeared again. As visitors, as witnesses, as translators between the inside and the outside. They waited in lines, not knowing what version of the person they loved would step through the door that day, alive, changed, or already lost to the distance that incarceration creates. Children watched their mothers navigate this world and learned from it, not through instruction, through observation. They learned how to speak carefully, how to listen longer than they talked, how to recognize fear without naming it. For these children, womanhood became associated not only with care, but with endurance under pressure. Some women inside the criminal world did rise to power. They managed operations, controlled finances, directed logistics. But even for them, authority was never identical to that of men. Their power remained conditional, watched, tested, questioned. Point one mistake carried heavier consequence. Point one rumor traveled faster. Visibility protected them from some threats and amplified others. For most women, the war did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived as a life rearranged slowly, dreams narrowed, routines adjusted, joy learned to exist in smaller spaces. Yet within those narrowed spaces, women still created meaning. Birthdays were still celebrated, food was still shared, songs were still sung softly inside walls meant to protect sound. These moments did not deny the war. They survived beside it. The women of the war were not defined by one role. They shifted constantly. Caregiver one day, protector the next. Silent witness always. They carried grief that did not fade with time, only with repetition and even. Now, long after many stories have left the headlines, it is often women who still hold the names, still hold the photographs, still hold the unanswered questions. As years passed, many women discovered that the war did not truly end when the violence moved elsewhere, that it simply changed where it lived. For some, it lived in memory. In faces that never returned. In birthdays that passed without messages. In places at the table that were never filled again. For others, it lived in dreams. Dreams where footsteps returned, where doors opened, where closure finally arrived, and then faded again with waking. Grief inside war is never clean. There are no proper timelines no official endings, only long stretches of waiting that slowly become part of identity. Many women learn to grieve without certainty. To mourn without confirmation. To hold space for both hope and loss without resolution. This uncertainty transforms sorrow into something heavier. A grief that does not close, only settles in. Across Mexico, entire communities of women quietly carried lists in their minds. Names, dates, last places seen. These lists were never written on paper because paper could be taken. Memory could not. Some women found strength in collective remembrance, support groups, marches, small gatherings in homes where stories were spoken softly. Others chose silence, not because they forgot, but because remembering alone felt safer than remembering publicly. The war also reshaped how many women understood love. Love became cautious, guarded, measured not only by emotion, but by risk. Trust no longer formed quickly. It grew slowly. Tested, verified, sometimes abandoned without explanation when uncertainty returned. Motherhood took on deeper weight inside the conflict. Raise a child in this world did not feel like guidance. It felt like shielding. Every decision became layered. Which school was safest this year? Which routes were predictable? Which friends were neutral? Mothers learned that protection was not absolute, only relative. Some succeeded in moving their families away from contested regions. Calmer cities. Quieter towns, sometimes across borders into the United States or beyond. Even in safety, the war traveled with them. In accent, in instinct, in the sudden tension at loud noises. For women who crossed borders, identity fractured in new ways. They were safe, but displaced, far from danger, but far from home. The war had taken from them not only people, but geography. Yet from these fractures, new forms of resilience emerged. Women created businesses from scratch, founded community centers, held families together across distance through screens and late-night calls. They rebuilt without fanfare, without applause, without acknowledgement. History will likely record the war through statistics, through seizures, through arrests, through names of men. But beneath all of that data lives a quieter truth. The war was also carried on the backs of women who kept life functioning when everything else fell apart. They kept children in school when schools felt unsafe. They kept food on tables when income vanished. They kept memory alive when institutions forgot. They learned to balance fear with routine, loss with obligation, pain with practical action. And perhaps the most invisible thing they carried was this: they did not stop believing in tomorrow. They simply learned to believe in smaller tomorrows. A safe night, a calm morning, a quiet school day, a message that arrived on time. These small futures were enough to keep moving. The women of the war were never only victims. They were architects of continuation. They did not end the conflict, but they refused to let it erase life entirely. And long after the headlines fade, long after new conflicts draw attention elsewhere, it is often women who remain behind as the guardians of memory, holding what cannot be restituted and protecting what still can be. Chapter 10. The uniforms in the street. For a long time, the war had faces without uniforms, gunmen without badges, commanders without rank, authority without insignia. Then the uniforms arrived in cities and towns across Mexico. The presence of the state became unmistakable. Convoys of military trucks, armored vehicles at intersections, soldiers standing where traffic lights once ruled. For many civilians, this was the first visible sign that the war had officially entered their streets, not as rumor, not as shadow. As force. At first, the arrival of the uniform brought something close to relief. People believed order might finally return, that the chaos would retreat, that someone was finally in charge again. Children watched soldiers with a mix of curiosity and fear. Some waved, some hid, some asked whether the war was finally over. For parents, answers were harder. The uniform represented protection, but it also represented escalation. Soldiers were trained for combat, not for neighborhoods. They moved in formation, spoke in commands, operated through force. Visibility. In plazas and marketplaces, their presence changed the emotional air instantly. Conversations softened, movement slowed, eyes followed every step. Police forces expanded their patrols. New checkpoints appeared overnight. Vehicles were searched without explanation. Names were recorded without context. For ordinary people, daily life became layered with uncertainty. Who controlled this street today? Who answered the radio call tonight? Which uniform belonged to which authority? Because inside the war, the uniform did not guarantee singular loyalty. Some answered to the state, some answered to fear, some answered to opportunity. The arrival of soldiers changed the rules, but it did not erase them. It added another set. Now civilians navigated not only between cartels, but between competing forms of authority. In certain neighborhoods, the presence of the army reduced open violence. Gunmen melted into alleys. Convoys vanished into distance. In others, military arrival triggered retaliation. Ambushes grew bolder. Threats became louder. The city learned that uniforms could draw fire just as easily as suppress it. The soldiers themselves were often young, drawn from distant regions, dropped into cities they had never seen before. Asked to distinguish enemies who did not wear uniforms, they patrolled streets where danger did not announce itself, where a stare could be a warning. Or a test. Some adapted quickly, others learned through fear. For police officers, the war erased the boundary between work and survival. Every traffic stop became unpredictable. Every routine patrol carried the weight of escalation. Officers learned to vary routes, avoid patterns that drive without attachment to routine. Some were celebrated quietly by their communities. Others were feared. Some were corrupted. Others resisted until resistance became too heavy to carry. The uniform did not make someone safe. It made them visible. And visibility, in this war, was always dangerous. At night, cities felt different under military patrols. Lights bounced off helmets. Boots echoed against empty streets. Sirens cut through neighborhoods that had already learned silence. Some residents slept easier, others slept less, because protection and danger had learned to coexist inside the same silhouette. The arrival of uniforms signaled a turning point. The war was no longer something whispered about. It was something the state now stood inside openly, but standing inside a fire does not always mean controlling it. As weeks turned into months, the presence of uniforms became routine, not comforting, routine. People learned the schedules, when patrols passed, when checkpoints shifted, when streets became quiet enough to move again. The war did not pause for the uniform. It simply adjusted its timing. In some districts, the uniform brought temporary calm. Markets reopened, public transport resumed. Businesses dared to operate past sunset. In others, the arrival of soldiers marked the beginning of nightly tension, because where authority moves openly, resistance often answers in shadow. For civilians, the rules doubled overnight. Do not anger the men without badges. Do not misunderstand the men with them. The smallest gesture could now be interpreted two different ways. A glance, a hesitation, a word spoken too slowly. Fear did not leave. It multiplied its directions. Inside the police forces, pressure intensified. Officers were expected to enforce law while navigating invisible power, ordered to move forward while knowing that forward could place their families at risk. Some officers refused, quietly transferring, requesting desk assignments, leaving the profession entirely. Others stayed, not from heroism, from lack of alternatives. For those who stayed on the streets, life became divided. The public face of authority, the private reality of vulnerability. Uniforms were removed at night, badges hidden at home. Children taught not to repeat their parents' profession at school. Families learned that protection required secrecy. The military faced a different burden. Soldiers were rotated through regions like pieces on a board. They arrived strangers, and often left before they understood the streets they had been ordered to stabilize. Some formed bonds with communities, distributing food, helping after storms, standing quietly at wounded intersections. Others remained distant, suspicious, trained to see threat before familiarity. Both approaches carried risk. When violence did erupt between soldiers and armed groups, it was explosive, not slow, not contained. Entire blocks froze. Windows closed in waves. Parents pulled children inward without explanation. Afterward, the streets looked the same, but felt different, as if the air itself had been disturbed. The symbolism of the uniform began to fracture. Some, it still meant protection. Others, it meant provocation. Others, it meant uncertainty. Conversations shifted. People stopped asking whether the army should be there. They began asking how long it would stay. The state had entered the war publicly now, but retreat was no longer simple. Because absence could be interpreted as surrender, the uniform became trapped between two meanings: shield, target. Some soldiers died in anonymous clashes that never reached national attention. Some were remembered publicly. Many were mourned quietly. For their families, grief came mixed with unanswered questions. Where exactly did it happen? Who exactly was there? Why did today become different from every other patrol? Just like civilians, uniformed lives also became statistics to the outside world and silent ruptures to the inside. Meanwhile, criminal groups adjusted their strategies. They avoided large confrontations when pressure was high. They waited. They watched. They shifted routes. The presence of the uniform did not remove criminal control. It rearranged it. In some regions, the military held intersections. Cartels held neighborhoods. Life moved between them like water between stones. For civilians trapped between these two authorities, neutrality became the only identity that felt safe. Not loyalty, not resistance, just careful passage. Children learned to recognize different uniforms. Which ones asked questions, which ones gave orders, which ones watched in silence. All of this taught a difficult truth. The uniform did not end fear. It gave fear a new shape. With time, the greatest weight the uniform carried was not danger. It was confusion. Soldiers and police were no longer seen only as protectors. They were also seen as possible risks. Not because every officer was corrupt, but because certainty had collapsed. In some regions of Mexico, trust in institutions had already been fragile before the war. The conflict did not break that trust. It finished eroding it. People learned not to assume that a uniform guaranteed protection. They learned to observe behavior instead. Tone of voice, eye contact, how long a vehicle lingered at a corner. The war taught civilians a painful skill: how to evaluate authority without believing in it. Corruption crept where fear already lived. Some officers accepted money to look the other way. Some accepted it to keep their families safe. Some refused and paid quietly for that refusal. Inside departments, suspicion spread. Officers stopped trusting partners fully. Information was shared in fragments. Silence became a survival tactic even among colleagues. This weakened operations, not through betrayal alone, but through hesitation. When no one is sure who can be trusted, movement slows. Opportunities disappear. Coordination fractures. For soldiers, the psychological toll became visible over time. Long deployments, urban warfare without clear front lines, the constant pressure of not knowing who in the crowd might be watching. Many developed a condition not named officially, but recognized immediately by those who lived it. Permanent alertness. Sleep grew shallow. Reactions grew sharp. Silence felt louder than noise. Some soldiers returned home changed, not wounded in body, but altered in rhythm. Families noticed it first. The way a door slammed too loudly. The way a laugh came too rarely. The way silence followed them into every room. For police officers, the emotional burden was different. They remained inside the communities they policed. They did not rotate out. They did not leave the war behind at the end of a tour. They went home to the same streets they just patrolled. Their children walked the same sidewalks they had just secured. Uniforms were hidden at home, but risk could not be removed with clothing. Some officers tried to leave the profession. Transfers, resignations, quiet disappearances into civilian life. Others stayed and grew older inside the conflict, their careers stretching across multiple phases of the war, watching tactics change, watching leadership shift, watching violence rise and fall like tide. The uniform aged faster than the person inside it. Despite everything, acts of quiet courage never stopped. An officer who warned a family before danger arrived, a soldier who moved a child out of a crossfire without orders, a patrol that turned away from easy corruption. These moments rarely appeared in reports. They lived only in memory, passed between families like quiet gratitude. The uniform also became a symbol of grief. Funerals with folded flags, sirens instead of music, rows of colleagues standing in silence while families broke openly. These losses did not make headlines for long, but they accumulated. Inside precincts, inside barracks, inside the people who remained. The war did not only exhaust civilians and criminals, it exhausted those asked to stand between them. By the end of this chapter of the conflict, the uniform had lost its clarity. It no longer symbolized simple protection. It symbolized duty under uncertainty, authority under suspicion, obedience under pressure. The state was now physically present in the war, but moral certainty had not followed it into the streets. And so the uniform became something far heavier than fabric and insignia. It became a promise that could not always be guaranteed. Protection was no longer absolute, only attempted. For civilians, the lesson remained painfully consistent. No single force owned safety. Safety had become situational, temporary, carefully negotiated each day. And for those inside the uniforms, the war did not end at the end of a shift. It followed them into sleep, into family dinners, into silence. Chapter 11. The Border That Never Rests. There is a line that appears simple on maps, straight, defined, certain, but on the ground, the border is not a line. It is a pulse. Between Mexico and the United States, the border never truly sleeps. Traffic flows day and night. Trucks move in endless columns. Pedestrians pass in silent routines. Lights glow across deserts and rivers. To most people, it is a place of work. A place of travel. A place of trade. To the war, it is something else entirely. It is the main artery. Every shipment that survives the journey south to north transforms into something larger on the other side. Not just drugs, money. This is where the conflict changes speed. What moves slowly through mountains accelerates through highways. What is hidden in rural roads becomes invisible in plain sight. The border is not only guarded. It is studied. By agents. By analysts. By smugglers. By accountants. Everyone is watching the same crossing points for different reasons. From the criminal side, the border is not a wall. It is a system to be memorized. Shift changes, blind angles, camera delays, inspection rhythms. The war at the border is not loud. It is precise. Most days, nothing dramatic happens. And that is exactly how it remains useful, because the true strength of the border economy is normality. Millions pass through legally every week. That scale creates cover, noise that hides signal. Inside this motion, contraband hides in everyday shapes. Cargo loads, fuel tanks, vehicle panels, shipping containers. Some shipments succeed countless times before ever being detected. Others never make it across, and each loss reshapes strategy. For the cartels, border failures are not emotional. They are calculations. Where did it fail? Why? What adapts next? From the state's perspective, the border is defense. From the cartel's perspective, it is opportunity under constraint. The two sides mirror each other in one way. Both are relentless. Every new fence invites a new tunnel. Every new scanner invites new concealment. Every new patrol schedule invites new. Timing.it is a race that never ends, only resets. For civilians who live in border cities, the war becomes layered. They live inside commerce and conflict at the same time. Tourists shop while armed men pass unseen blocks away. Families cross for work while shipments cross hidden within the same traffic. The border creates a unique contradiction. It is one of the most regulated spaces on Earth, and one of the most exploited. For many, the border is hope. A paycheck. A job. A new life. For others, it is profit. Industrial scale. For the war, it is the place where everything converges: supply, demand, money, pressure, visibility. Every major shift in the conflict eventually echoes here. When violence rises in the South, seizures increase in the North. When leadership changes, trafficking patterns shift within weeks. The border never announces these changes. It simply absorbs them into traffic flow. For agents stationed there, time feels distorted. Long stretches of routine, sudden moments of crisis, then routine again. For smugglers, the border represents both promise and risk in equal measure. Every successful crossing strengthens the empire. Every failure tightens surveillance just a little more. This is not a frontier in the old sense. It is a shared operating system between two nations. Point one running on law, point one running on profit, both moving at once inside the same space. As long as this border moves, the war moves with it. Beneath the fences, beneath the cameras, beneath the rigid architecture of control, the border developed a second landscape, an underground one. Tunnels appeared long before they were detected. Not crude passages, but engineered corridors, lit, ventilated, reinforced. Some stretched the length of football fields. Others ran beneath streets where cars passed daily without knowing what moved below their tires. Each tunnel represented months of planning, surveying, excavation, silencing vibration. Entire crews worked without ever seeing daylight. When one tunnel was discovered, it made headlines. But for every tunnel found, others continued operating quietly, already paid for, already memorized, already forgotten by the earth itself. Above ground, ports of entry became theaters of routine tension. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of inspections, dozens of false compartments. The process was mechanical, slow, unforgiving. For traffickers, the goal was never certainty, only probability that if 90 shipments passed and one failed, the system still thrived. Human smuggling routes grew alongside drug routes. Families moved through deserts, across rivers, through safe houses that offered no true safety. Some crossed seeking work, others fleeing danger, some guided by smugglers who saw people as cargo under a different name. The war spilled into these human movements. Migrants were taxed, threatened, sometimes recruited, sometimes erased. The border did not only move products. It moved desperation and opportunity together. In border cities, normal life and invisible commerce overlapped constantly. Restaurants served families at dinner, while illicit convoys passed 2 streets away. Children played soccer in lots layered with surveillance they could not see. For residents, it felt like living inside a current, always moving, never resting, too large to fight directly, too close to ignore. Law enforcement on both sides evolved with the same urgency as the traffickers. New sensors, new data analysis, new satellite tracking. Technology made the border sharper, but traffic made it porous. Every innovation produced a reply. Every tightening produced a workaround. Every seal produced a new seam. Smugglers studied patrol behavior the way pilots study weather. They waited for holidays, shift changes, budget gaps. Weather systems, storms became cover, blackouts became opportunity, chaos became camouflage. The border had its own seasons, busy seasons, quiet seasons, and seasons when both sides prepared for the next shift they felt coming but could not yet see. The violence tied to the border rarely stayed fixed. It pulsed outward. When seizures increased, retaliation followed elsewhere. When detection slowed, expansion surged in distant cities. This made the border less of a location and more of a trigger point, a place where pressure redistributed itself across an entire conflict. For civilians, the greatest danger was never knowing which night would be different, which delay would matter, which routine crossing would become a story told quietly years later. Families learned never to assume safe arrival, not because danger was constant, but because it was random. For the war, randomness was not chaos. It was camouflage. Across this moving frontier, the two nations remained locked in a shared contradiction. One side demanded supply, the other paid for it. Both strengthened the system they publicly fought. The border did not judge intentions. It only processed motion. As long as movement continued, the war continued with it. Over time, the border stopped being viewed as just territory. It became strategy. Political pressure rose on both sides. Public demands intensified. Seizure numbers were announced. New initiatives were funded. New promises were made. But the border had already learned how to absorb policy, not reject it, not obey it, adapt to it. Every surge in enforcement created a surge in innovation. Every crackdown produced a redirection. When land crossings tightened, sea routes expanded. When ports were reinforced, air corridors adjusted. When one region hardened, another softened. The war treated geography like water treats stone. It shaped itself around resistance. In Mexico, border communities lived inside constant fluctuation. 1 year, the town thrived with traffic. The next, it emptied after pressure shifted elsewhere. Businesses rose and fell with invisible currents, not because demand vanished, but because routes rerouted. For local families, stability became something they stopped expecting. They learned to live with motion instead of permanence. On the other side, in the United States, the border existed mostly as news as debate as statistics discussed at distance. The violence felt far. The movement felt abstract. The consumer end of the war rarely saw the road it traveled. This distance became one of the war's greatest shields, because what feels distant rarely feels urgent. Policies changed with administrations. Strategies shifted with funding. Rhetoric escalated and softened in cycles. The border absorbed it all, unmoved, uninterrupted. For traffickers, the goal was never permanence. It was continuity through change. They learned not to rely on one corridor, not to trust one route, not to build one system. Flexibility became survival. For agents and analysts, the realization slowly set in. There would be no final securing of the border, only endless calibration. The line on the map remained fixed, but the war flowing through it remained fluid. Every generation of smugglers memorized new patterns. Every generation of agents learned new counters. Neither side ever reached final advantage. This created a conflict without climax, without resolution, without a final chapter. The border did not offer endings. It only offered throughput. For those who crossed it legally every day, the war existed as background noise. For those who moved within its shadow economy, the border was destiny. For both, it was unavoidable. The war did not begin at the border, and it will not end there, but it will always pass through it. This is the deepest truth of the northern frontier. It is not just a boundary between nations. It is the circulatory system of the entire conflict. As long as the border moves, the war moves with it. Chapter 12. The Journalists and the Silence. At first, the war was loud. Gunfire echoed through streets. Convoys burned across highways. Headlines screamed in bold letters. Then, something changed. The war began to quiet the people who tried to describe it to in Mexico. Being a journalist did not simply mean reporting. It meant choosing how much danger to carry into every sentence. Not every reporter covered the cartels directly. Some wrote about corruption, some about local government, some about crime victims, but all of it intersected with the same. Shadow.at first, threats arrived as warnings. Phone calls that ended before voices spoke. Messages written without names. Cars that passed too slowly outside homes. The message was never detailed. It did not need to be. Stop. Some journalists listened. They changed beats, switched careers, left towns quietly. Others continued, not because they felt fearless, because they felt responsible. Responsibility is a heavy word in a war where truth itself becomes a target. Newsrooms learned to practice self-censorship. Articles softened, names disappeared, details blurred into generalities. Not because journalists wanted to lie, but because accuracy now carried fatal weight. In many regions, people began to notice something strange. Violence continued, but reporting faded. There were fewer bylines, fewer investigations, fewer follow-ups. The war did not become less brutal. It became less documented. For communities already living in fear, this created another layer of uncertainty. Events happened, but without public record, without confirmation, without acknowledgement. Silence became its own form of violence. Some journalists were targeted not for what they wrote, but for what they might write. Others were punished for stories that had already been published. Threats extended beyond individuals. They reached into families, children, parents, partners. The warning was clear. Truth was no longer personal. It was collective risk. Across the border in the United States, reporting often continued with distance and protection, but distance changed perspective. It softened immediacy. It turned lived terror into unfolding story. Inside Mexico, the reporters did not watch the war. They lived inside it. Some traveled with cameras, some with notebooks, some with memory alone. Because recording itself became dangerous, even journalists who avoided cartel topics could not avoid consequence. Power no longer required mention to feel threatened. The war had learned the power of narrative, and it had learned how to strangle it. Without sound, by the time many realized how deeply silence had spread, entire regions had already become informational deserts. People knew something was happening. They simply no longer knew exactly what. As silence spread, reporting did not disappear. It changed shape. In many parts of Mexico, journalists began writing in code, not with symbols, with omission. Stories were published without naming who was responsible. Unknown armed men, unidentified groups, unconfirmed sources. Readers learned how to interpret these phrases. They understood what could not be written. Some reporters shifted from crime coverage to human interest stories, food, culture, local events. On the surface, it looked like normal media. Underneath, it was survival. Others moved their reporting online under false names. Blogs appeared without editors. Social media accounts posted anonymously. Information traveled without signatures. These platforms were fast, unfiltered, but fragile. An anonymous account could vanish overnight. A blog could be taken down without warning. A name could be traced despite every precaution. Truth became temporary. In smaller towns, entire newsrooms closed. Not officially. One reporter left, then another. Then the office doors simply stopped opening. The buildings remained. The voices did not. For young journalists entering the profession, the war reshaped ambition. They did not ask, "What stories do I want to tell?" They asked, "Which stories might let me live?" Some accepted international fellowships. They left the country quietly, not as exiles. As survivors of a profession that had become unlivable at home. From abroad, they continued reporting, but distance altered urgency. What was once immediate became observational. Inside the country, families of journalists carried a unique form of fear, not only of violence, but of attention. A published name could bring danger to the entire household. A photograph could become a target. Some families encouraged silence. Others supported quiet persistence. Every household negotiated its own risk. Public trust began to fracture, not always toward journalists, but toward information itself. When headlines disappeared, rumor filled the space. Messages traveled through voice notes, through whispers, through fragments of social media. Truth became unstable, contradictory, hard to verify. In this environment, the war gained a strange advantage. It did not need to hide. It simply needed to outlast attention. Across the border in the United States, journalists still documented the conflict, but distance turned suffering into scope, into numbers, into analysis. Inside Mexico, journalists faced something different. They faced consequence in real time. Yet despite everything, some continued, quietly, persistently, without banners or applause. They wrote about families left behind, about corruption in small offices, about victims whose names no one else would print. Their work rarely trended, rarely went viral, but it preserved fragments of truth in a landscape designed to erase it. These journalists did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as witnesses. Witnesses who understood that when stories vanish, power grows unchecked. The greatest loss the war threatened was not only life, that it was memory. And memory requires someone willing to hold it still long enough to be seen. For many journalists, survival eventually meant distance, not from the truth, from the place where the truth had become lethal. Exile did not arrive with ceremonies, that it arrived with suitcases packed at night, station tickets bought without farewell, phones turned off one last time before crossing borders. Some left Mexico believing they would return in months. Many never did. From abroad, they continued reporting. With protection they had never known before, with safety that felt unfamiliar, with the constant guilt of distance. They watched their homeland through screens. Interviews conducted over encrypted calls, sources who whispered from the same streets they once walked openly. Information traveled outward, but danger remained inside. International organizations began documenting patterns, disappearances, threats, vanished newsrooms, silenced regions. The war, long measured in violence, was now also being measured in absence of reporting. Each missing byline, each closed publication, each blank space, where investigation once lived. And yet, even in silence, truth found narrow paths. Mothers spoke when journalists could not. Communities whispered where reporting had vanished. Families shared stories in churches and kitchens long after headlines moved on. Memory became decentralized and no longer held only by newspapers, but by ordinary people who refused to forget. That in small towns, walls became archives. Names painted where they could not be printed. Faces taped where they could not be broadcast. This was journalism without platforms, documentation without institutions, truth without microphones. The war had not destroyed information completely, it had driven it underground. Across the border in the United States, investigators pieced together stories from fragments, court cases, witness testimony, financial records. The history of the conflict was now being written backward, not from headlines, but from evidence. For the journalists who remained inside Mexico, life settled into a delicate balance, right? Enough to contribute, not enough to provoke. Expose patterns, avoid names, describe systems, avoid faces. This kind of writing carried its own emotional cost, because every softened sentence meant something important was being left unsaid. Each article became a negotiation between truth and survival. And yet, without these compromises, there would be no record at all. The silence was never total. It was selective, controlled, strategic. It created blind spots large enough for violence to hide comfortably. Inside, the greatest victory the war ever achieved was not dominance of territory. It was dominance over attention. When the world stopped watching closely, the war learned how to breathe without witnesses. But truth has one quality violence never fully eliminates. It waits in documents. In memories. In testimonies deferred rather than destroyed. And even now, long after some of the loudest phases of the conflict have softened into routine, truth continues to surface slowly. In courtrooms. In leaked records. In the voices of those who outlived their fear. Silence never fully won. It only delayed the reckoning. The journalists who were lost to exile, the journalists who were lost to fear, and the journalists who were lost entirely, all left behind something the war could not erase. A trail of questions. And questions, once planted, cannot be silenced forever. Chapter 13, Prison, Power, and the Criminal State. Prison is supposed to be the end of power, the place where control dissolves, where commands stop traveling, where fear is replaced by walls. But in the Mexican drug war, prison rarely meant disappearance. It often meant relocation. Inside Mexico, the prison system did not exist apart from the conflict. It became part of it. From the outside, a prison looked sealed, concrete, steel, watchtowers. From the inside, influence moved with surprising ease, through guards, through visitors, through phones, through money. Some high-level figures entered prison not as fallen leaders, but as relocated rulers. They arrived with reputations that traveled ahead of them. And reputations are a form of protection. Inside many facilities, power reorganized itself quickly. Who controlled food distribution? Who controlled cell assignments? Who controlled communication? The state officially controlled the gates, but inside, authority often followed a different logic. Money flowed inward quietly. Bribes softened rules. Privileges multiplied for those who could afford them. Private cells appeared behind public bars. Protected wings inside general population. For low-level inmates, this created a brutal hierarchy, not based on sentences, not based on justice, but based on external allegiance. That if you belonged to the right outside structure, your inside life changed instantly. That if you did not, survival depended on invisibility. Some prisons evolved into command centers rather than containment zones. Orders left just as easily as they once had from safe houses, routes adjusted, payments authorized, punishments approved. The walls did not stop communication. They slowed it only slightly. Visits became meetings. Lawyers became messengers. Phones became lifelines between confinement and continuity. In this way, incarceration turned into a different phase of command, less mobile, but still connected. When rival leaders were placed inside the same facility, tension recalibrated, sometimes into fragile coexistence, sometimes into internal war. The prison became its own echo of the streets outside, divided, aligned, watched. For the state, this presented an impossible contradiction. Prison was meant to isolate criminal power. Instead, it concentrated it. Across the border, in the United States, some extradited leaders faced a different reality: stricter isolation, heavier surveillance, reduced communication. But even then, influence did not always vanish. It weakened. It adapted. It slowed. Back inside Mexico, families of incarcerated figures experienced a strange double life. Publicly, they were relatives of prisoners. Privately, they remained connected to ongoing power. Some lived with protection they did not acknowledge. Others lived with threats they could never explain. For victims' families, this created a painful truth. The person linked to their suffering was locked behind bars, yet their influence still moved freer than memory ever could. Prison did not feel like justice. It felt like delay. Inside many facilities, violence did not stop. It changed scale. Targeted attacks, silent punishments, disappearances that left no public record. The war did not pause at the prison gate. It flowed through it. This is how incarceration became one of the most misunderstood spaces of the conflict, seen as an ending, functioning as a continuation under a different name. As prison populations swelled with cartel arrests, the institutions themselves began to bend. Not suddenly, gradually. Facilities built for containment became ecosystems of control. Wings divided not by security level, but by allegiance. Some areas grew quieter, protected, cleaner. Others became compressed with tension, overcrowded, unstable. This imbalance was no accident. It reflected the same hierarchy that ruled the streets outside. In certain prisons, riots were not spontaneous, they were negotiated. Expressions of pressure. A rule violated. A payment disrupted. A leader transferred without notice. And suddenly, fire appeared where silence had lived moments before. For officials, these events were described as outbreaks. For those inside the system, they were messages that moved outward, toward authorities, toward rival groups, toward the wider war. Some riots ended quickly, others burned for days. Their causes softened in official statements. Their consequences felt deeply inside families who waited outside walls without answers. Escapes followed a similar logic. Not always chaotic, sometimes surgical. A door unlocked at the right hour. A camera inactive for the right minute. A transport delayed just long enough. Some escapees vanished completely. Others reappeared months later in different regions, alive, active again. Each escape carried a deeper meaning than freedom. It carried proof of reach. The message was not only that someone could leave. It was that the system itself could be persuaded to open. Guards stood at the center of this pressure. Some resisted quietly. Some adapted reluctantly. Some became part of the current without ever fully admitting it. The war reshaped how guards thought about their roles, not as neutral keepers, but as exposed figures standing between two implacable forces. For many, the uniform inside prison was no safer than the one on the street. It offered authority, but invited consequence. Families of guards learned this quickly, just as police families had learned. Before them, Children taught to avoid conversations. Spouses taught to erase routines. Inside the prisons, communication evolved. Phones were hidden in walls that in mundane objects that passed inspection because mundanity looked harmless. Messages left without voices. Codes without names. Commands that traveled invisibly through concrete. The idea that isolation could stop influence quietly collapsed. Prison became not a boundary, but a node, a place where information pooled before being redistributed. For some incarcerated leaders, prison offered a rare advantage: visibility without vulnerability. They were known to be inside, and therefore not where rivals could reach them easily. This inverted the logic of power. Freedom became risk. Incarceration became stability. From these cells, deals were made, alliances shaped, violence scheduled, not loudly, not urgently, but with the long patience that confinement teaches. Meanwhile, low-level inmates bore the cost. Those without backing, without protection, without value beyond survival. They navigated threats from gangs, from corrupt authorities, from the invisible weight of belonging to no one. For them, prison was not a continuation of power. It was exposure to it. Some emerged hardened, some broken, some disappeared without record inside the churn of anonymous confinement. For victims' families on the outside, each transfer, delay, or riot reopened wounds. Justice felt perpetually postponed, always promised, never fully realized. Prison was meant to conclude stories. Instead, it appended them endlessly. The state faced a truth it struggled to pronounce: it had built walls strong enough to contain bodies, but not strong enough to contain networks. And networks, once embedded, do not obey architecture. They obey leverage. This is how correctional institutions became one more terrain the war learned to occupy, not by assault, but by persistence. Over time, something deeper took shape beneath the riots, the bribes, the escapes. A transformation not of violence, but of structure. In parts of Mexico, the relationship between crime and the state no longer looked like conflict alone. It began to resemble coexistence, not in official declarations, not in written policy, but in routine. In patterns. In the quiet acceptance of limits that were no longer questioned. Local officials learned which areas could not be governed directly, which projects could proceed only with permission, which investigations would stall without needing explanation. The criminal world did not need to replace the state. It only needed to occupy the spaces the state no longer fully controlled. This is how the idea of a criminal state quietly formed. Not a nation run openly by cartels, but a nation where criminal power and public administration learned to overlap without fully merging. In this hybrid space, taxes were collected by both sides. Protection came from more than one authority. Rules shifted depending on which power was physically closer that day. For civilians, this created a dangerous ambiguity. When something went wrong, who did you appeal to? Who could actually help? Who would make things worse? Justice became conditional, not on law alone, but on alignment. In some regions, the criminal structure resolved disputes faster than courts ever had. Land conflicts, business disagreements, personal grievances. The decisions came quickly. The consequences came faster. This did not create fairness. It created finality. And finality, when offered in a broken system, can feel like order. Meanwhile, inside prisons, the same pattern repeated at smaller scale. The state controlled the perimeter. The criminal networks controlled the interior rhythm. Official programs existed, schedules were posted, rules were announced, but daily reality obeyed a different logic. Who ate first? Who moved freely? Who spoke without consequence? Who vanished without explanation? These were not decided by law. They were decided by connection. The criminal state did not announce itself with flags or constitutions. It announced itself through predictability, through the quiet understanding that certain outcomes could be expected if one knew where power truly resided. This predictability became one of its greatest dangers, because predictable power feels permanent. For younger generations growing up in this environment, the distinction between legal authority and criminal authority blurred early. Both issued rules, both demanded compliance, both offered consequences. Only one offered speed. When speed replaces procedure, procedure begins to feel irrelevant. This is how institutions lose meaning without collapsing. They continue to exist, but their authority no longer feels exclusive. The criminal state did not arrive with a coup. It arrived with adaptation. It adapted to enforcement, to incarceration, to political cycles, to military deployments. Every attempt to contain it reshaped it into something more. Embedded, from the outside, it still looked like a war between two sides, state versus cartel, law versus crime. From inside daily life, it often felt like shared territory, danger managed by competing powers, stability negotiated through fear and profit. This did not mean the state disappeared. It meant its reach became uneven, strong in some places, absent in others, negotiated in many. The prison system revealed this most clearly. If the state could not fully control even those it physically confined, then its authority was facing a truth it had long delayed. Power was no longer centralized. It was fragmented across overlapping systems. Justice, in this environment, became fragmented too. Sometimes legal, sometimes negotiated, sometimes violent, sometimes silent. For victims, this fragmentation produced a haunting uncertainty. Not only will there be justice, but which version of justice will arrive? The criminal state does not replace law with chaos. It replaces law with alternatives. Alternatives enforced by fear. Alternatives funded by cash. Alternatives stabilized by reputation. And once alternatives take root, they do not vanish simply because official policy changes. They persist in habits, in expectations, in survival strategies passed quietly between people. By the end of this chapter of the war, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The conflict had not only challenged the state with violence, it had challenged it with structure, not by tearing institutions down, but by building shadow versions beside them. This was the most enduring transformation of all, not the body count, not the territory lost, but the reshaping of what authority itself meant in everyday life. Chapter 14, The Families Left Behind. When the gunfire fades, when the sirens move on, when the headlines change, someone always remains behind. In Mexico, the war did not end for families when violence passed through their streets. It settled into their homes. For every arrest, there was a mother waiting. For every disappearance, a child asking questions. For every body never found, a family suspended between hope and mourning. The families left behind did not carry weapons. They carried time. Time measured in unanswered calls. Time measured in untouched bedrooms. Time measured in birthdays without candles. Some lost sons, some lost daughters, some lost parents, some lost everyone at once. But loss did not arrive only through death. It arrived through absence. A man who left for work and never returned. A teenager who crossed a street and vanished from memory. A father taken into custody and never heard from again. Without bodies, grief became suspended. No ceremony, no certainty. Only waiting. Families learned a painful new vocabulary. Missing, unidentified, unknown, presumed. None of these words offered closure. Daily life continued around them. Shops reopened. Traffic returned. Neighbors resumed routines. But inside these homes, time moved differently, slower, heavier. Mothers learned how to hold hope without letting it break them. They checked phones in the night. They listened to footsteps outside. They memorized the sound of every approaching engine. Children grew up beside photographs that never aged. Faces frozen at the moment they disappeared. For many families, justice felt distant, not delayed. Distant. Investigations stalled. Files closed quietly. Witnesses stopped speaking. Families learned what it meant to be alone inside systems that moved forward without them. In some towns, entire neighborhoods were shaped by collective loss. Women who all searched. Children who all waited. Grandparents who raised what remained. These families did not organize for power. They organized for memory. They formed small groups, shared information, shared rumors, shared what little hope could be carried by many hands. Across the border in the United States, some families waited too, for sons who crossed and never arrived, for daughters who called once and went silent, for relatives lost between borders and systems. The war created a quiet diaspora of families searching in different languages for the same answers. When families went to authorities, they learned another version of waiting. Forms, appointments. Offices that opened and closed around their grief. Some never stopped asking. Some stopped because asking became too heavy. Silence shaped many households, not because they forgot, but because remembering hurt too loudly. Yet despite everything, these families continued living. Children still went to school. Food was still cooked. Music still played sometimes, softly. Life did not stop. It narrowed. This is the part of the war that never appears in official timelines, the years of quiet endurance. The invisible labor of surviving loss every day. For many families, grief never arrived all at once. It arrived in waves. One day felt survivable. The next felt unbearable for reasons no one could explain. A smell, a song, a familiar laugh in a stranger's voice. These small moments reopened everything. Not violently, quietly. Some families created rituals without realizing it. The candle lit every night at the same hour, the plate left untouched at the table, a jacket never moved from the back of a chair. These were not acts of denial. They were acts of continuity. Children learned to grow up beside uncertainty. They stopped asking after a while. Not because they stopped caring, but because they sensed the pain in every answer. Many learned to protect their parents emotionally. They smiled more. They asked fewer questions. They learned how to carry silence early. In some homes, anger replaced sorrow. Not loud anger, focused anger, toward institutions, toward strangers, toward fate itself. In others, exhaustion took over. A tiredness that no amount of sleep corrected. A fatigue born from holding on to hope for too long. Families split under the pressure. Some members wanted to keep searching. Others wanted to stop and try to live again. Neither path felt right. Both felt like betrayal. For those whose loved ones were confirmed dead, the pain changed shape, but not weight. Certainty did not bring peace. It only closed one door and opened another. Now there was no waiting, only remembering. Funerals were held or could not be held. Some bodies were returned, some never were. Without a body, grief remained suspended in a different way. It was neither past nor present. It simply hovered. Many families faced financial collapse alongside emotional loss. Salaries disappeared overnight. Support vanished. Legal processes delayed aid for years. Mothers took multiple jobs. Grandparents raised children on pensions. Teenagers left school early to help keep homes afloat. The war restructured families not by intention, but by necessity. Yet within these broken structures, forms of strength emerged that no one planned. Siblings became protectors. Neighbors became extended family. Communities shared what little certainty they still possessed. In some towns, everyone knew which houses carried the heaviest silence. They spoke gently near them. They offered food without asking questions. They watched children grow without parents. This was not charity. It was recognition. Recognition that anyone could be next. That loss was not personal. It was environmental. Many families learned to live inside two parallel realities. The external one, where life moved outward, and the internal one, where a moment remained frozen forever. They learned to laugh in one world, while carrying absence in the other. Time did not heal in the way people promised. It reorganized. Pain did not disappear. It found new places to settle. For some families, the act of telling their story became survival. They spoke to anyone who would listen: journalists, volunteers, strangers. For others, silence became the only protection they trusted. They stayed quiet not because they were weak, but because they were tired of losing what little remained. What united all of them was this: none of them chose this role. None of them volunteered for remembrance. None of them asked to become guardians of unfinished stories. Yet they carried them anyway. As years passed, many families realized something difficult to name. The war had not only taken people. It had rearranged identity. A mother became a searcher. The child became a witness. A home became a place of memory rather than rest. People were no longer introduced only by their names. They were introduced by absence. She is the sister of, he is the son of, they are the family who lost. Loss became a public label even when grief remained private. In Mexico, entire communities learned to recognize themselves through shared absence, not through celebration, through endurance. Children who once waited for parents eventually grew into adults carrying unanswered questions into their own families. When they had children of their own, they told stories that had no endings, only beginnings. This is how inheritance changed. Not land, not wealth, unfinished sentences. Some families eventually chose to leave the towns where everything had happened. They moved to quieter cities, to distant regions, sometimes. Across the border into the United States, distance offered safety, but it also deepened longing. They became both protected and displaced, safe from danger, but separated from the last places where memory felt anchored in new homes. The war became something spoken about at night, in low voices. After children were asleep, it surfaced during holidays, during sudden silences, during moments when happiness felt unfamiliar. For some families, forgiving the world became possible, not forgiving the crime, not forgiving the loss, but forgiving the idea of continuing to live without answers. For others, forgiveness felt impossible, not out of bitterness, out of loyalty to memory. Many learned to live with contradiction. They built futures while honoring what could not be restored. This did not mean they moved on. It meant they moved forward carrying weight. The families left behind became quiet historians of the war, not through documents, through kitchens, through conversations, through what they chose to remember aloud. They preserved details the world forgot, the way a loved one laughed, the last meal they shared, the moment before everything changed. In official records, these stories were rarely visible, but in real life, they were the longest surviving evidence of the war. The violence shaped headlines for years, but families carried consequences for generations. What the war took from them was not only people. It took certainty, continuity, and the promise that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. What remained was something harder to define. Not hope as people imagine it, but persistence. The ability to wake up again. To feed children. To work. To speak. To remember. The families left behind did not rebuild cities. They rebuilt meaning. They proved something the war could never claim. That even when everything visible is destroyed, life still finds ways to continue quietly. The war changed borders, changed institutions, changed power, but it also created ordinary people who became extraordinary in one simple way. They stayed. They stayed with memory. They stayed with absence. They stayed with love that could not be returned. And in doing so, they became the unseen foundation beneath everything that would come after. Chapter 15. The War Without an Ending. Every war is supposed to finish with a treaty, with a surrender, with a date written into history. But some wars do not conclude. They dissolve into routine. In Mexico, the drug war never reached a final page. It simply learned how to live between headlines. Years passed. Leaders fell. New leaders rose. Routes shifted. Weapons changed. Yet daily life continued beneath it all. Children were still born. Schools still opened. Markets still operated at dawn. The war did not stop these things. It learned how to move around them. For outsiders, the conflict often feels like a sequence of phases. A violent year. A calmer stretch. Another eruption. For those living inside it, the war feels different. It feels like weather, sometimes heavy, sometimes quiet, always present in the forecast. This is how a conflict without an ending reshapes perception. Violence is no longer shocking. It is anticipated. People learn to distinguish sounds, fireworks or gunfire, engine failure or explosion, celebration or alarm. Fear becomes calibrated, not eliminated, adjusted. The state continues to announce new strategies, new deployments, new reforms. The criminal world continues to adapt in parallel, not in defiance. In rhythm. Each side moves as if expecting the other to exist permanently, because by now, they do. Across the border in the United States, attention rises and falls with cycles of news. A surge in coverage, then silence, then another surge. But inside Mexico, coverage is no longer the measure of impact. Routine is. When violence becomes familiar, survival becomes skill. People do not ask, will this ever end? They ask, how do we pass through the next week? Entire generations have now grown up without knowing a clear before. The war is not a disruption. It is background. For them, roads with checkpoints feel normal. Helicopters at night feel expected. Stories of disappearances feel inherited. This is what a war without an ending does. It erases the concept of conclusion. It creates a world where people do not wait for peace. They manage instability instead. Yet, even inside this permanence, something subtle continues. Resistance through normalcy. People fall in love, open businesses, raise families, laugh at dinners, not in denial of the war in defiance of it. The war remains, but it does not own every hour. Still, the hardest truth of all remains suspended. No single capture will end it. No single operation will erase it. No single policy will conclude it. The war is no longer an event it is a condition. As the years stretch forward, the war reshapes itself into something harder to recognize. Not a battle, not a campaign, but a permanent tremor beneath daily life. In Mexico, people no longer mark time by peace and conflict. They mark it by relative stability. A quiet month. A tense season. A sudden eruption. Then quiet again. This rhythm becomes familiar, and familiarity is dangerous. Because what becomes familiar also becomes tolerable. Children grow up learning routes that avoid risk. They learn which hours belong to daylight, which belong to caution. They learn which conversations stay inside the home. These lessons are not taught in classrooms. They are taught in tone. In pauses. In the way adults change their faces when certain names are spoken. For the older generations, memory becomes heavier with each passing year. They remember a time before the war learned how to stay, before fear had addresses, before disappearance became a verb. For younger generations, that world sounds like a story from another country. Across the border in the United States, the war remains linked to politics, debate, and cycles of attention. But inside Mexico, attention is no longer the central force. Endurance is. Endurance in the face of uncertainty. Endurance in the face of loss. Endurance in the face of adaptation. The criminal organizations continue to fragment and recombine. The state continues to pursue and restructure. Each year brings changes, but not conclusions. This creates a strange stillness beneath constant motion. A sense that everything is moving, yet nothing is fully resolving. For communities, this unresolved state produces quiet fatigue, not theatrical exhaustion. Subtle where people grow tired of promises, tired of new strategies, tired of believing that the next change will be the final one. Hope does not vanish, but it becomes smaller, more careful, less loud. What remains strong is something else. Attachment to ordinary life. People plant gardens even when the future feels unstable. They celebrate birthdays even when names are missing. They rebuild after violence even when they suspect it may return. This is not denial. It is refusal to surrender meaning. The war without an ending does not announce its presence every day. Some days feel entirely normal. School runs, work shifts, evening meals. Then, without warning, it appears again. In sirens. In messages. In the sudden absence of someone who was there yesterday. And after a while, normal days return. If nothing happened. If everything happened. This is the quiet contradiction at the heart of endless conflict. Life continues, but it does not continue unchanged. People carry the war not only in memory, but in instinct. How fast they walk, how they listen, how they read silence. The war no longer needs to prove itself. It is already understood. As time moves forward, the war no longer feels like something that interrupts life. It feels like something that exists inside it. In Mexico, entire generations have now grown up without a memory of true separation between peace and conflict. They do not remember a moment when the war started, because for them, it has always been here. This is how a conflict becomes inherited, not through ideology, not through loyalty, but through environment. Children learn caution before they learn confidence. They learn silence before they learn speech. They learn distance before they learn trust. These are not lessons written on paper. They are learned through observation, through the way adults pause before answering, through the way certain topics close conversations instantly, through the way fear is carried without explanation. And yet, these same generations also inherit something else. A quiet defiance. A determination to live anyway. They grow up watching their parents rebuild after loss, after displacement, after broken certainty. They learn that survival is not dramatic. It is repetitive. It is routine. It is built day by day in ordinary motions. For the outside world, the war will always be discussed in timelines, before and after, escalation and de-escalation, surges and declines. But for the people who live inside the conflict, time does not feel divided. It feels continuous. This is the deepest truth of a war without conclusion that it stops feeling like a chapter and starts feeling like a climate. Across the border in the United States, attention will continue to rise and fall. Policies will change, strategies will shift, debates will renew. But for Mexico, the question is no longer only how to end the war, it is how to heal from something that never officially ends. Healing without ceremony, healing without treaties, healing without a clear date when the violence stopped. This is the hardest kind of recovery because it requires people to rebuild while uncertainty remains. And still, they do. They rebuild shops. They rebuild homes. They rebuild families. They rebuild trust in the smallest units possible. Point one relationship at a time. Point one neighbor at a time. Point one quiet decision at a time. The war shapes them, but it does not fully define them. This is what endurance truly looks like. Not victory, not resolution, but continuing to exist with meaning even when the future feels unstable. The war without an ending teaches one final truth: that power can last for years, violence can last for decades, fear can travel across generations, but life lasts quietly in every space fear fails to fully occupy. People still fall in love, still celebrate births, still dream of futures that do not include gunfire. And in these moments, the war loosens its grip, not because it has ended, but because it has been outlived, one ordinary day at a time. There may never be a single moment when this war is declared over, no official final page, no ceremonial ending. But in the homes that choose to keep living, in the families that keep rebuilding, in the children who still imagine futures larger than fear, the ending is written quietly, not in policy, not in history books, but in continuation. And now, the story grows quiet, not because everything has been resolved, not because the pain has vanished, but because tonight, we step away from the noise. This was not just a story about cartels, power, or violence. That it was a story about people who continued living inside a world that never truly gave them peace. That a war without a final battle. That a conflict without a clear ending. That a nation that learned how to breathe beneath constant pressure. Yet even inside that pressure, life continued. Families still formed. Children still dreamed. Love still found space where fear could not fully reach. If you made it to the end of this series, take a moment now to breathe slowly. Let the heaviness of the story settle gently. Let the day fade. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this quiet space with me, wherever you are in the world. And if these stories help you rest, reflect, or simply feel less alone in the dark, don't forget to subscribe. There's another story waiting for you every night. For now, close your eyes. Let the world grow still. This is True Crime Records. Good night.